Chapter 865. After witnessing the Lord's hospitality in Valhalla, little Pero no longer doubted who was the most powerful person in Erewhon. While everyone else was surprised by the magnificent scenery of Valhalla, he kept an eye out. His mind had always been more flexible, so he could notice that the elven girls in charge of receiving them were the most outstanding archers among the tree elves. He also noticed that the officers of the White Lion Guards who came and went wore magic armor. This was definitely not the kind of power that a local noble in a small country like Erewhon should have. He thought that those who opposed the count were definitely genuine fools, especially those nobles in the north of Erewhon. They were all real good-for-nothings, a plate of loose sand not worth mentioning. This lord definitely had the ability to transform this small kingdom according to his wishes. At a glance it was obvious that he was a man with great ambitions, and he definitely needed this group of people. But before he could speak, Aaliyah on the side spoke first. The guy pursed his lips as if he had been holding back this sentence for a long time, and if he did not say it as soon as possible, he would die in a moment. The Lord is out hunting. If you don't mind, you can invite guests, and we happen to be free to help you hunt a bear, an elk, or something in this forest. That damned reckless idiot. Little Pero wanted to kick Aaliyah, but privately he had to admit that the latter's straightforwardness was sometimes a good tactic. It's just that the cruise people have lost all their face because of him. Brando chuckled and replied in all seriousness. As the host, I'm embarrassed to entertain guests with a few stinky bones. My lord, according to our cruise tradition, not all hunted prey are to be roasted on a bonfire. You can nail their heads on a wooden board and hang them in the room. Hang the stinky head of the bloodstaff in the room? I don't seem to have such a bad taste. Brando thought to himself, but it's about time you said that. He turned his gaze to little Pero on the side, understanding that this young man was the one who had a say in this group of knights. Of course, there was also Lenorette, who had a tacit attitude. However, the eldest prince had been living in seclusion during this period of time, and rarely left the camp. He was like a noble daughter who was afraid of being exposed to the light. Little Pero lowered his head. My lord, the bear and elk definitely won't be able to escape from your grasp, but I think the hunters may still have some problems. Hunter. My lord, in winter, hunters often invite their friends and family when they hunt together. They also try to choose experienced hunters because everyone wants to be the first to shoot the best prey. Young people are impatient and will often alert the enemy. Brando's heart skipped a beat. He had already realized what the other party wanted to say. He frowned and said, Continue. My lord, I've studied some of Cruise's early war history. Apart from the war between the Holy Sanctum, most of the wars between the lords below are relatively simple and full of variables. It's not that they don't want to arrange a delicate plan to defeat their opponents in one fell swoop, but most of the lords know what their subordinates and retainers are like. Their actions are often influenced by hot-headedness or superfluous fear. They often act in private and destroy the overall situation. Therefore, the wars between the territories are often about who makes fewer mistakes. Little Pero was just short of saying that his plan was an armchair strategy. Brando's face turned red. Fortunately, it was not obvious in the misty rain. In the past, the battles he commanded were carried out by professional players. The so-called gap in execution and discipline of the players was compared to the modern army. But for the aristocratic army of this era, it could be called a model. In the Amber Sword, even the players of small and medium-sized guilds were comparable to the White Lion Legion in terms of discipline and execution. The large guilds were even more so. After all, as long as the orders were not unreasonable or restricted personal freedom, most players would not go against their own guild points. These memories of the past created an illusion that made him almost forget that it was neither the players who were cooperating with him now, nor the disciplined White Lion Legion, but the Duke's private army that even the Southern Legion and the Vermeer Legion could not compare to. These armies were mostly a motley army composed of 7 or 8 lords and their knight and attendants. It would be strange if there were no problems. His thinking had been affected by the stereotype in the game, and he had almost forgotten about this matter. Fortunately, little Pero and the others were the most professional soldiers at this time, and had received good training in military history and battlefield analysis. They could see the loopholes in his arrangement at a glance. He could not help but look at the thin young man again. The other party did not say any nonsense. and just a sentence of analysis established their position in his mind. It seems that letting these folded sword knight join this battle was the right choice, Brando thought to himself. As expected of the future generals of the Cruz people, they are not inferior to the rumors at all. At least this deal has not been a loss so far. The current situation is already like this, how can we remedy it? My lord, there is no need to remedy it. The situation on Madara's side is no better than ours. Even this military operation is the product of a moment of hot-headedness for Madara. The Bloodstaff brought in the Dark Lords of the Sea of the Dead Moon. But those lords are no different from our lords. Their army is also full of hot-headed and wrong judgments. This battle is still equal for both sides, not to mention that we have the initiative, and our military strength is far superior to those skeletons. Victory is inevitable in my opinion. Brando calmed down and realized this. What little Pero said earlier was just to remind him not to take things for granted, and at the same time highlight their role. My lord, we are more concerned about where you intend to use us. You are not suitable to appear on the main battlefield for the time being, but right now there is a place where you can be of use. If those lords really act rashly and alert the enemy, it is inevitable that an army will be needed to go around the back of the Bloodstaff army and delay the skeleton's advance. Little Pero looked at the Count Tonajul with some appreciation, thinking that this was also a smart man and understood what he meant at once. However, they also had their own pride and replied faintly, My lord, the Bloodstaff army will not be able to move a step, not be delayed. So these are Cruz's people. Brando thought to himself. However, it was not impossible for a group of knights with average strength above the gold rank, and as many as hundreds of people to block the Bloodstaff's retreat. Don't make too much of a ruckus. I will arrange the position to look like the White Lion guards under my lord, and we will evacuate first before the others arrive. Brando smiled. It was easy to talk to smart people. He looked at the folded sword knight present and could not help but feel a little pity. How nice would it be if these people were Erwin's people? Do you want to find a way to make them stay? This thought suddenly flashed through his mind, but then he shook his head. This problem was too special. For little Pero and the others, if they lost their sense of glory as soldiers, they would not be able to grow into real generals in the future. Forget it, let's take one step at a time. Besides, it's not like there aren't any geniuses among Erwin's people. After receiving a positive answer from Brando, the folded sword knights, who had been depressed for a month, seemed to have been rejuvenated. These young knights were all full of energy. How could they be idle? After learning that they could go into battle to kill the enemy, they could not help but rejoice. The preparation work of little Pero, Brund, and Aaliyah was also going very smoothly. In fact, the folded sword knights had been a string taut all this time, waiting for Brando's final answer from top to bottom, so there was actually no need to prepare at this time. In just half an hour, everyone was ready to go. Of course, this also showed that these young people from Cruz were well trained. If they were placed in the ordinary noble cavalry, even if they were prepared in advance, it would take at least an hour or two to finally get ready. At this time, Freya arrived at Brando's army under the escort of several Highland knights. The arrival of the Valkyrie brought bad news to Brando. Sure enough, as little Pero expected, Duke Viro's retainers hurriedly launched an attack before Brando arrived. After she learned the news from Eek, she immediately went ahead to inform Brando. According to Freya, in order to cooperate with Viro's army, Anthony's army and the Highland Knights had also launched an attack one after another. Now the battlefield between the two sides was unfolding in the middle of the Silofin Hills, and was in a fierce battle. After she finished speaking, she could not help but look at Brando's face, thinking that he would be furious, but she did not expect Brando to just smile bitterly and shake his head, as if he had expected it. Freya, go and get ready, the White Lion guards are waiting for the order to attack. Medisha will cooperate with you. This is the first real war for Tonajul's army. I will also leave the Wind Archers under your command. Brando? Both Viro and Anthony's armies have moved. We must also speed up to cooperate with them. If they want to suffer, then let them. But is this okay? It's okay, the Bloodstaff can't win. It's just that some people will suffer a big loss. On the contrary, we Freya, this is the first battle after the White Lion Guards and the Wind Archers formed an army. I hope they can leave a deep impression on all the enemies of this kingdom. All the enemies? Brando nodded. In his heart, those rotten vines and rotten branches that blocked the path of this kingdom, they were about to be swept away. Erwin would usher in a new life from this moment on. The saplings planted in Tonajal were finally about to sprout and take root. This battle began on a gentle slope to the west of Silafarvan Hills. The whole slope was east-west, and there was a dense linden forest on the hillside. As early as a day ago, a noble knight from Viro had brought his attendants to this forest to ambush. This knight named Planchet was neither a confidant of Duke Viro, nor an important retainer of the Duke. Strictly speaking, he was just an insignificant person. He came from the barren territory of the tranquil wind forest, a truly poor person. He only came to this muddy water for two purposes. The first was for money, and the second was to enter the eyes of the Duke. In order to realize this ambition, he sold his family's wealth and pulled up this group of people. For the first time in his life, he rode a horse, wore a set of tailor-made leather armor, painted the emblem on the shield, raised the flag and followed the army to Silafarvan, a place even poorer than his hometown. However, although Planchet was greedy for money and fame, he was not a hot-headed young man. Before he came, he had inquired clearly that this expedition was to deal with the skeletons of Madara. The legend of those skeletons could be talked about for 3 days and 3 nights. During the First War of the Black Rose, there was even an army of Madara that entered the Viro province along the Erek Mountains. Although Planchet had never seen these terrifying opponents, he had heard of their ferocity from various sources. Before he really made up his mind to go all out, this knight also thought about it again and again, but in the end a bold plan formed in his heart. He did not know where he heard a legend, but it was said that the skeletons of Madara were controlled by liches. As long as the liches were killed, the skeletons would naturally lose their ability to fight. The liches themselves did not have much combat power, so once they were attacked from the back, they would be like fish on a chopping board. This way Planchet had a plan in his heart. He wondered why he did not hide, wait for the skeletons to pass by, and then rush out to slaughter the weak liches. In the end he could effortlessly obtain a great merit. Although this knight did not know a word in his life, he was very satisfied with his plan. He felt that he might be the kind of person who was born with the ability to command. Although the Bloodstaff army had not arrived yet, he could already see the scene of him being conferred the title of Marquis in the future. However, when Planchet arrived in Silafarn, he realized that there seemed to be some differences between his ideal and reality. First of all, it started to rain in the hills during autumn, which brought a lot of trouble to the army stationed in the forest. Including this night, they had to march in a wet environment every day. Their feet were muddy, and they felt like they had rolled in the mud every evening. But the saddest thing was that they did not even have a dry and comfortable place to sleep. Sometimes they could only wrap themselves in a cloak and sleep in the mud for the whole night. Planchet had experienced this before. In just 2 or 3 days he was complaining incessantly like the others. He almost cursed the heavens and the earth. Fortunately, half a week after the rain started, the army finally entered the designated ambush area. But unfortunately, Planchet realized that the situation in front of him was somewhat different from what he imagined. In his imagination, the so-called ambush was to hide in the valleys on both sides and wait for the Bloodstaff army to pass by. Then they would suddenly attack and cut off the skeletons from the middle. Of course, he would hide at the back and wait to kill the liches that were the easiest to deal with. But when he arrived in Silafarn, this knight realized that it was not the case at all. The entire battlefield was bigger than he imagined. At a glance, there were only undulating mountains, continuous hillsides and connected forests. He couldn't see the road at all, let alone distinguish the direction. In such a situation, Planchet felt that it would be difficult for him to even figure out the direction of Madara's army, let alone go around to the back and kill the liches. At this time the big shots began to divide the area one by one. Then, they designated the scattered knight and lord to be stationed in their own ambush area. Planchet was divided into such a linden forest. That was fine. But Planchet had always been optimistic. In such a situation he was still able to figure out the situation around him. He soon found that most of the people stationed around him were poor like him. They were ambitious and wanted to take advantage of the opportunity to make a fortune. This discovery made him feel great pressure. Before this, he always thought that he was one of a kind, or rather, a person with an adventurous spirit who dared to seize the opportunity to rise to the top. But he didn't expect that there were so many people who were as bold as him. So, he immediately began to feel pressed for time. Fortunately, this morning he was received by a big shot. Of course, it was with the other knight. But this was enough to make Planchet pay attention because it was said that the big shot was an important minister of Duke Vero. Of course, the content of the meeting was probably to raise their vigilance because the Bloodstaff army had already made contact with the scouts of Vero's army early yesterday. But with his innate sensitivity, Planchet heard another meaning from the other party's words. It was a tacit agreement that they were allowed to attack without orders at the right time. And they didn't have to wait for a predetermined time to launch an attack. This was because the big shot also said that opportunities on the battlefield were fleeting, and the outstanding knight had to learn how to seize them. Of course, if Planchet had some military knowledge, he would understand that this was just nonsense. If Brando was here, he would probably sneer at the Vero nobles for being so obvious in order to gain merit. But almost everyone believed that victory was in sight, and a little indulgence didn't seem to be a bad thing. Of course, this had nothing to do with Planchet. He only felt that this was a good omen no matter what. And this good omen didn't stop. This afternoon, he finally saw a small group of skeleton knight running through the linden forest. Following closely behind this skeleton cavalry was an army of skeletons. There were about a few hundred skeletons in this army, but of course Planchet couldn't count them. He only felt that he had never seen so many undead. They were densely packed on the hillside. This must be the army of the undead. He was extremely nervous, but a thirst for merit and money calmed him down, as if overcoming his fear. He felt his heart pounding. The opportunity he had been dreaming of was right in front of him. Sure enough, after a while, he saw a group of skeletons wearing robes and holding staffs in their hands appear in his field of vision. If he was familiar with the army of Madara, he would definitely recognize that these were the skeleton wizards who cast detection spells in the vanguard and were responsible for supporting the scouts. But for Planchet, they only had one identity: necromancers. The opportunity is here, Planchet secretly said to himself. Oh. Chapter 866. Planchet did not understand that he might be able to change the outcome of a war. If he understood this, he would have felt extremely honored. Less than a quarter of an hour after the battle in Silafarvan began, Vero's Night Lords were the first to feel that something was wrong. In fact, it would be abnormal if they did not feel that something was wrong. When the knight named Planchet recklessly led his attendants out of the linden forest and charged towards a large group of skeleton mages, of course, he thought they were necromancers. The battle in Silafarvan was destined to slide in a direction that they did not expect. Planchet's action was like a signal to the night boys to hurry up and fight for the credit that belonged to them. Although no one blew the horn, it was as if the horn had suddenly sounded. All the knights who were lying in ambush in that area screamed and rushed to attack Planchet. In this way, this action instantly affected the entire left wing of Vero's army. Before their commanders had time to react, they found that the front wing of the army had been completely disconnected. Everyone could not help but be stunned at that moment. In order to get rid of the troops from other areas and fight for credit, they more or less hinted to their subordinates that they could take the initiative to attack under tacit consent and did not have to wait for the predetermined time. But the problem was that it seemed to be too early. The supreme commander of Vero's army was only stunned for a moment before he could not help but curse. "Who?" he roared. "Whose subordinate is that?" Everyone around him was silent at this moment because Planchet had indeed chosen a good time. So good that even the Bloodstaff's army had not really entered the encirclement of Vero's army. The sudden attack also stunned the undead. The Dark Lords from the Sea of the Dead Moon reacted quickly and steadied themselves almost immediately. They thought that since the humans were prepared, the skeleton army in the vanguard would definitely be destroyed. They immediately gave up on the skeleton army and retreated to prevent the human army from attacking their main force. However, these experienced dark mercenaries were surprised to find that the human knights did not seem to notice them at all. Instead, they excitedly charged towards the vanguard. Of course, their first reaction was not to think that the left wing of the human army would break off and attack their vanguard. Instead, they thought that the vanguard was just a bait. If they dared to go forward to support the vanguard or let the vanguard retreat, The main force of the human army hidden in the surrounding hills would appear and give them a heavy blow. This was a logical thought. After all, no one would expect their opponent to suddenly go crazy, although the truth could sometimes be so absurd. But at this moment, the Bloodstaff could not help but be a little stunned. The enemy is not the vanguard? But where did this human army come from? Of course, if the Bloodstaff only saw the knight as a wing of Viro's army, then the number of this army was still acceptable. But the problem was that the Bloodstaff and the Dark Lords under it had a preconceived notion that this was just the vanguard of the human army. This vanguard bait had more than 2,000 people, so wouldn't the human army that was lying in ambush here be more than 20 to 30,000 people? No matter how hard the Bloodstaff racked its brains, it could not figure out where these damned Erewhon people had gathered so many people. Of course, that was if it still had brains to rack. The hesitation of the undead army in Viro's eyes had another meaning. The Bloodstaff's army now had about 1,000 skeleton warriors on the surface, and a third of this number were skeleton archers. In addition, there was also a large number of skeleton cavalry. The latter were mercenaries from the Sea of the Dead Moon. These were basically all its forces plus hundreds of dreadlings as well as some ghosts, zombies and other miscellaneous undead, but they were not large. And now, the vanguard of this undead army was under the attack of Erewhon's people. The vanguard was only made up of a few hundred skeleton warriors, a few dozen skeleton wizards who were in charge of casting detection spells, and a few teams of skeleton cavalry scouts. With such a small number of people, they had pinned down the entire left wing of Viro's army. This result made all the commanders on Viro's side feel at a loss. If the undead commanded the army to charge over at this time, Viro's army would probably collapse completely from the left wing in an instant. Countless people were cursing the recklessness of the knights below. Although they also wanted to abandon Brando and fight for this glory and credit alone, they did not expect the knights below to be even more anxious than them. Before the Bloodstaff's army entered the encirclement, those damned fellows had already launched a charge in advance. At this moment, these commanders immediately experienced the helplessness that Brando had experienced earlier. However, just when they thought that this time they were bound to fail miserably, Madara showed a very cautious attitude. The skeletons were obviously shrinking their defense, as if they were going to give up on their vanguard. Everything in front of them was simply a blessing from the heavens for the commanders of Viro's army. They could not help but feel a little suspicious. What were these skeletons doing? After all, the lords under Grand Duke Viro were not really stupid. They quickly guessed Madara's thoughts, but even if they guessed it, no one dared to act rashly. They could only watch the entire left wing kill the enemy's vanguard, praying that those idiots would realize the current situation and quickly withdraw after taking advantage of the situation. Of course, on the other hand, they also prayed that Martha would bless them so that those damned skeletons would not see through any flaws. They did not dare to send more men to help the left wing. They did not even dare to move. The skeletons of Madara thought that they had also sent out the vanguard. Once the other troops were exposed, the enemy would realize their arrangement no matter how stupid they were. By then it would all be over. Grand Duke Viro's supreme commander could not help but sweat. He never dreamed that the battle would reach this point. He could only quickly order the private noble army lying in ambush on the main line and the right wing to quickly adjust their direction, just in case the left wing was defeated. At least they could still hold on. On the one hand, he was also silently praying that Anthony's army could catch up with their pace and join the battle. Madara had nearly 10,000 troops, while Viro and Anthony's coalition had a total of 15,000 men. If Anthony's army could join the battle in time, the situation would not be as dangerous as it was now. But what made him feel bitter was that it was precisely because they had previously abandoned Anthony and Tanajal's army and acted on their own that they were now in such a dilemma. At this moment, His Excellency could not help but feel that they had brought this upon themselves. So at this moment there was a strange balance on the battlefield. Both sides of the battle were praying for a miracle. Viro's side hoped that Madara would not be so quick to see through their low-level mistakes, while Bloodstaff was anxious to find out who was ambushing them and how many human troops were in front of them. According to the judgment of the Dark Lords, there was at least an army of more than 20,000 men in front of them. If this judgment was true, Bloodstaff could only pray for a miracle so that his army could escape from this hill. At this moment he actually had a kind of understanding in his heart. The army in front of him was probably from Vero or Anthony. However, what happened next left everyone dumbstruck. The knight's charge was in progress. The meadow on the hillside was like a light blue wave. This wave was moving forward. The most glorious moment of Planchet's life was probably at this moment. He was riding on a horse, holding a shield high and a long spear in his hand. Although he was staggering all the way and his horsemanship was almost unsightly, in any case, he was the one who led the army to launch the attack. With thousands of men and horses following behind him, he was like the tip of the sharp spear. At this moment, he finally understood what the knight's so-called glory was all about. This was glory. He could not help but shout, as if his voice alone could make these liches in front of him to disarm and surrender. He felt that he was in the limelight at this moment, and he must have entered the eyes of those important people. He was the first knight to launch an attack, and he was about to bring a glorious victory to Vero. This time, he would definitely become an important minister by the Grand Duke's side. Of course, Planchet would never have dreamed that the real important minister by Grand Duke Vero's side, the supreme commander of Vero's army, would definitely cut him into pieces if possible. However, Planchet was unaware of this. He was still immersed in the romance of the night. He suddenly felt that he had lived the first half of his life in vain, and this moment was the life he really wanted. For this moment he felt that even if he died right away it would be worth it. Perhaps Martha felt his desire, and was willing to give him a push from behind to help him achieve his ultimate goal in life. All in all, in the eyes of Master Planchet, the liches were like fish on the chopping board. They shouldn't be able to put up any resistance at all. As long as he slaughtered his way into their midst, these damned skeletons would turn into ashes like clay chickens and pottery dogs. If it were a human army, perhaps they would have been scared witless and pissed their pants by now. However, contrary to Planchet's expectations, the skeletons immediately raised their staffs. At that moment he felt that he might have been deceived. Another of Master Planchet's dreams was to become a wizard, having heard the bards speak of their prowess in the bars. Until the last moment of his life, he finally witnessed the beauty of magic with his own eyes. In fact, it was not that beautiful. The skeleton mage pointed at him from afar. Planchet barely had any time to react. Half of his body swelled up and exploded into a cloud of blood mist with a bang. This death was not a perfect ending for the knight, but for the others it was just the beginning of the horror. This shocking way of dying stunned all the attendants who followed Planchet. A living person exploded into a pile of minced meat right in front of them, and the blood and organs splattered all over the people behind them. Even a real professional soldier might not be able to withstand such a shock, let alone these so-called nobles who were temporarily pulled up by the so-called nobles. Thus, it was only natural that these attendants would break down at the first moment. Their minds were in a mess. The only thought they could think of was to turn around and run. Then they collided with the knight behind them. The center of the battlefield was suddenly in chaos. Then, the skeleton mage's black magic exploded in the human army one after another. Most of the knights were at Planchet's level. They had long heard from various sources that the undead were just so. As long as they could overcome their fear, the undead were not even as good as human soldiers. Seemed to be true. In fact, many people set foot on the battlefield with this mentality, but the problem was that they soon found the gap between their ideals and reality. They realized that overcoming their fear did not seem to be an easy task. Even the leading knight was scared out of his wits, let alone the attendants behind him. The braver ones simply pulled the reins of their warhorses and went around the two sides of Madara's vanguard. Some of these people were lucky enough to survive. The less courageous ones turned around in a flurry, and most of them collided with their own men. One must know that the battlefield had a certain slope, and the result of such collisions could be imagined. A large number of knights were thrown off their warhorses and fell to the ground. Then their comrades, who were not good at riding, trampled over them. It was a horrible sight to behold. There were also some who were completely terrified and directly charged into the army of skeletons. However, the problem was that there were too few of them. The small number of skeletons that charged into the army of skeletons were impaled on the spears, and used as an example to others. Just like that, in less than 10 minutes, the entire left wing of Vero's army was completely defeated by the undead, who were less than a quarter of their number. Or rather, they were completely defeated by themselves. Of course, this was not because the quality of Viro's private army was really bad. On the one hand, it was because their commander made a mistake. He was afraid that the knights from all over the country would drag the duke's private army down, so he gathered them all on the left wing. Of course, his original intention was that the left wing seemed to be easier to fight because of the terrain. But he never dreamed that these damn guys would be so undisciplined and rush out on their own. Not only did they rush out, but they also inexplicably collapsed. Of course, this was also because most of the local armies in Viro had never fought against Madara before. It was just like how the Vermeer army was defeated by the undead army in the First War of the Black Roses. That was not a reflection of their true fighting strength, but the natural fear of the undead that the humans had towards them. But in any case, the current result was a death sentence for the supreme commander of Viro's side. No matter how weak their left flank was, the destruction of the entire left flank, exposing one side of their army to the enemy's attacks, had already announced the final outcome of this war. The important minister of Duke Viro stood there in a daze, his forehead full of cold sweat. At this time on Madara's side, whether it was the Bloodstaff or the Dark Lords under him, they were also stunned. A moment ago they were still praying that they could escape from this ambush, but what happened next was like a clumsy comedy that inexplicably played out in front of them. The vanguard of the human army that took the initiative came prepared, and had several times more numbers than them, but it was actually defeated just like that. What kind of show was this? The Dark Lords under the Bloodstaff looked at each other. They came from the cruel battlefield at the border of the Sea of the Dead Moon, and both sides of the war were veterans who had been on the battlefield for a long time. Few people on the battlefield would make such a low-level mistake. When they saw this scene according to their instincts, the first thing that came to their mind was not that the humans opposite them were joking, but that this was not a terrible trap. Imagine a trap that required the sacrifice of 1,000 or 2,000 of their own people. The ultimate goal must be to wipe them all out. If these Dark Lords could still sweat, they must be drenched in cold sweat like the supreme commander of Viro. But among everyone, only the Bloodstaff reacted first. It had interacted with these Erwin the most and knew some of their natures very well. It almost immediately realized that there was a problem. Of course, it was always cautious and did not immediately rescue its vanguard. Instead, it waved its staff and sent a command to the back. And at the same moment when it gave the command, dozens of Dreadwraiths flew out from the undead army and flew toward the Erwin's position in front of them. If the supreme commander of Viro's side had a last glimmer of hope before this, but after seeing the terrifying flying undead with wings that were several meters wide, he immediately understood that it was all over this time. Madara would soon find out what was going on in front of them. Imagine an army that had lost a wing and could not be gathered back in a short period of time. What kind of scene would it be if they were exposed in front of the enemy's main army? Moreover, the enemy had skeletal cavalry, and they did not even have a chance to escape. If there was any hope in the Supreme Commander's heart at this moment, it was that the Anthony army that they had left behind and the Tanajul army under the command of the Count could quickly appear on the battlefield. The sooner the better. Oh, P.S. Everyone who follows, likes, and supports this book, have a happy weekend. The second chapter is here. May I ask for monthly votes, by the way? Chapter 867. The sudden turn of events on the battlefield disrupted all the arrangements, and Brando understood for the first time that the so-called precision plan was basically equivalent to the decree of Hessa I, the Lord of the Road, under the art of command in this era. It was just a joke. The old-fashioned command structure and sloppy discipline of the noble army, especially the retainer knight, was the enemy of all commanders. In such a situation, what you had to consider was not praying that there would be no mistakes but rejoicing that there were no mistakes at all. The more complicated the plan, the more loopholes there would be. The Slovenian region was located to the north of the Silman Valley, southeast of the Tosankade Forest, and at the end of the Grimoires province in the Chablis Mountains. The low valley hills cut off the connection between the plains of Lake Valendon and the Silman Valley, like a natural barrier. A few tributaries that fed into Lake Valendon cut across the hills, forming a few relatively flat valleys. The army of the Bloodstaff advanced along these valleys, and Cohen's men had long been tailing them to find out the direction of their march, and found out that these skeletons might pass through the two valleys of Kreven and Chenier. Kreven and Chenier were the two most important passages in the Slovenian hills. These two valleys were surrounded by the Jondel Mountains, and were forked to the north, with many small hills in between. At this time of the year, there were many large linden forests on the flat slopes that could be used for an ambush. This place was almost an ideal place to set up an ambush, and the Bloodstaff seemed to have never considered that there would be an alliance from Lantanailan and Viro ambushing him here. His previous victory had made him arrogant, and that was why he was defeated here in history. In Brando's original plan, the four armies of Viro, Lantanailan, Tonajal, and the Highland Knight would set up an ambush in the Creven and Chenier valleys, and open up an encirclement of about 20 miles. Lantanailan's army would be the first to block the attack, and then Viro and Tonajal's cavalry would go around to the flatter valleys at the back to launch an attack, and completely annihilate the Bloodstaff's army. However, the current situation had developed beyond everyone's expectations. The Bloodstaff's army was divided into two, and moved forward in the valleys about 7 or 8 miles apart. When the vanguard on the wing encountered Viro's army, the retainer knight in Viro's army could not hold back the excitement in his heart and launched the attack first. The result was that the Bloodstaff's army did not enter the encirclement at all. Except for a small vanguard, its main force was actually still in front of Lantanailan and Viro's army, and even further away from Tonajal's army. An ambush battle had turned into a blocking battle from the start. What was even more dangerous was that Viro's army was completely exposed to Madara's army. They had already lost a wing, and their morale was quickly crumbling. As for the others, especially Lantanailan's army and the Highland Knight, they had no idea what was happening on their side. After they learned that Viro's army had launched the attack first, they immediately changed their battle plan and tried to go around to the side of the Bloodstaff's army first. Little did they know that their own people had already poked a hole in the cover of the encirclement. Eek was still leading a small number of his cavalry in the mountains and forests, and he could only pray that Viro's damned knight would not cause too much trouble. But Makarov and Audin were not very optimistic about his small wish. They knew too well about the private armies of these nobles. If they were allowed to pursue or hold their ground, they might be able to exert 70 to 80% of their strength. But if they were to fight head-on, they would collapse in an instant. It had to be said that these two old nobles were very insightful about the situation in their own kingdom. Although they had not seen it with their own eyes, they were not far from the truth. Among all the parties involved in this battle, Brando was the first to receive reliable information through the magic transmission of Cohen's subordinates. Magic transmission was still very rarely used in wars in this era because it could only transmit text, and Woan's decryption skills were really terrifying. With the existence of magic similar to decryption ciphertext, it could directly restore the original meaning of the person who wrote the ciphertext. Naturally, the commanders would not want their orders to be leaked to the enemy. However, decryption ciphertext was not flawless. On the contrary, the way to counter it was actually very simple. As long as the messengers were divided into two groups, one person would be responsible for writing the ciphertext, and the other sorcerer apprentice would only need to copy it. This way, the messengers would only think of the original text, and the secret hidden within would not be revealed. The so-called simple was only after one understood the principle of the magic. The problem was that in this era, most mortals' understanding of magic was still at the level of understanding, but they did not know why. The silver sorcerers called them charlatans, while the real sorcerers paid more attention to the knowledge contained in magic. Most of the Bugas were scholars, and most of the human sorcerers were sorcerers. This was the difference between them. In fact, the Bugas sorcerers had long found a way to counter this magic, but it was their secret. It was only after the Slate War that the Iron Folks army was popularized. However, Erwin now had Brando as an outsider, so the so-called barrier of knowledge had become non-existent. He directly plagiarized the sorcerer's method. However, this method did not require much technical content, and it was very simple to spread. Once the magic communication was popularized, countries with strong military power and a large army like Madara and Cruz would benefit far more than Erwin. Therefore, Brando had never used this technology publicly in the army, and often only used it in some intelligence exchanges with his confidants. Unless he was sure that Erwin could gain enough benefits to offset the impact of using it in a large-scale war, he would never easily spread this secret for the Bugas. In fact, Brando already had a plan in mind, but the war with the Bloodstaff was not that serious. He put away Karglai's magic letter in the drizzle. Madara's defeat of Viro's old knight army was not unexpected, but Viro's commander dared to gather the retainer knights from the lower territories and put them on the left flank. Such boldness made him a little speechless. I don't know if this is overconfidence, or the so-called self-cultivation of an actor. Brando thought to himself. If those things were given to him, he would rather send them to Madara to fight against him than command them. The reason why he used things to describe the retainer knights was because Brando had a deep impression of the so-called army made up of small landlords, broken knights, and opportunists. In history, they had buried the nobles in the north just like today's stupidity. But I'm afraid that the commander is in a dilemma. At least in name, these knights are still the vassals of the Grand Duke of Viro. If they are willing to wave the flag and shout for their master, it is an act of loyalty and righteousness. If the Grand Duke of Viro dares to not accept it, his prestige will be gone. Brando knew that the rules of the game of these old nobles were the cornerstones of this era. Knight and lord were the cornerstones of this era. But unfortunately, these cornerstones had begun to shake from the bottom. Lords, your era is over. At this time, he still had the leisure to think of a famous bard's poem in the game. Brando felt a little relieved in his heart. Fortunately, Madara had defeated the Grand Duke of Viro. What he was most afraid of was the Grand Duke of Viro's army attacking first and alerting the Bloodstaff beforehand. This Dark Lord, who was known for his vigilance, would turn his army around and retreat to Silman. If that was the case, things would become troublesome because Ranner was still in Erwin's territory. They were ambushing the Bloodstaff now to take advantage of the time difference. If the Bloodstaff was defeated in the ambush, Ranner would lose his foreign aid and retreat to Madara, and his morale would naturally collapse. But if the Bloodstaff was curled up in Silman and gave Ranner a chance to break out in this direction, then the three armies of Tonajul, Viro, and Anthony would not be able to hold on for long in this hilly area in the middle of nowhere. If Ranner and the Bloodstaff were to join forces, then the chaos in the south would not end until Ranner and the Bloodstaff joined forces. But what surprised Brando was that he had guessed that Viro's retainer knight army was terrible, but he did not expect them to be this terrible. When Karglai's letter said that Viro's left wing was defeated by hundreds of skeletons, he almost thought that it was a joke. But Karglai's would not joke with him at this time, so Viro's army was really defeated like a miracle. It was just a miraculous stupidity. He flicked the letter and walked to the side, grabbed the saddle and got on his horse. The army was moving out in the rain, and everyone was getting on their horses. Farther away, the young wizards of Tonajul were gathering under the leadership of the Shire. The wizards climbed onto the phantom stallions summoned by magic, wore the same silver-gray robes and hoods, and turned their gazes towards the direction of the army. Among them were the warlocks from the mercenaries, the youths who had just completed their apprenticeship in Valhalla and Abi's castle, a small group of druids brought by Quinn, and lastly, a few female wizards. Most of them had pale faces, cold expressions, and high cheekbones. They were witches from all over the world, and they were persuaded by Babasha and two other witches to join Brando, or rather, the future Dark Dragon. But no matter what, Brando finally had the first Magician Legion in the south. There were a total of 120 people, and their strength varied. A quarter of them were warlocks and wizards from various mercenaries, a quarter of them were scholars from Tonajul and the Royal Knight Academy, and a quarter of them were witches and druids. This Magician Legion was like a group of beggars in the eyes of a regular army, but it was unprecedented in the south. The leader of the Magician Legion was naturally the Shire, but the deputy leader was Amandina. Ever since Seeker of Wonders saw her talent and took her in as an apprentice, she began to systematically learn magic knowledge. Even though she was still an apprentice, her attainments in magicite technology were far beyond the reach of most people. Brando knew the future of the Magician Legion, so it was natural for Amandina to be in this position. Then there were the Wind Archers. This was a legendary army born from the Silver Elves' Forest Legion, the Princess Guards. Their commander, whether present or past, Medisha, sat on a unicorn, her spear hanging on the saddle. She clasped her hands together and prayed. Just like the ancient Silver Elves, they prayed for the heroic spirits of their ancestors in the forest to protect them, so that they could be brave and fearless and defeat their enemies. They were also praying for the souls lost in the war. The Silver Elves' singing was ethereal, and all the tree elf archers stopped to listen, their faces full of worship. As for their deputy leader Fina, she had long been the Silver Elven Princess' most ardent fan. Among all the troops under Brando, only the White Lion Legion was quiet and orderly. The young men from Tonajal seemed to be used to the atmosphere under Brando's command, and the officers and soldiers from the original White Lion Legion were full of curiosity. However, there was a sharp sword in their eyes. This sword was shining brightly in Freya's hand. Ever since this sword reappeared in the world, the new White Lion Legion had gained a soul. Their deputy commander, Karglais, was far away in the Silman Hills in the south. Naturally, it was impossible for him to appear in this army. By Brendel's side, only Hipamela and Sheeta were left. The former was wiping the thick surface of the mountain range. Rainwater fell on the stone scepter, and the scepter actually emitted a circle of green light, as if it was bursting with life in the soil, full of a lush aura. However, the little fat dragon did not dare to utter a single word. It roasted Hipamela's prawns and ate them. The divine priest girl did not cause any trouble for it during dinner. Instead, without a word, she went straight to the door with the mountain range's will in hand. Hipamera benefited the most from the battle in the deadly frost forest. At this moment, her strength had recovered to the level of elemental awakening. Coupled with the almost invincible Gaia's scepter, Sheeta's fate could be imagined. Anyway, from then on, it saw Hipamera like a mouse seeing a cat. The last group of people to appear in Brando's vision was the cruise's Broken Sword Knight Regiment. These proud knights rode past the bottom of the hill one by one, raising their swords to signal him. Although there were not many of them, only a few people understood the horror of this knight regiment. Little Pero was still wearing his thick cloak with his crossbow inserted under it. He raised his head and looked at Brando. "My lord, is the news reliable?" "It's reliable without a doubt," Brando replied. Little Pero showed a slightly surprised look. In this era, it was very difficult to tail and investigate the undead army. This difficulty mainly stemmed from two aspects. On the one hand, before this, the Black Rose of the Roman Tool rarely appeared in the eyes of the world. Even in the eyes of Erewhon, the Dark Kingdom was a broken and weak country. Less than 10 years before the First War of the Black Rose, the lords of Karsuk often led their troops into Madara's territory to plunder in revenge. Although the undead of that era were terrifying, the Dark Lords were like a plate of loose sand. They could not wait to see their colleagues attacked by humans so that they could take the opportunity to annex them. In that era, it was almost impossible for a Lord of Madara to fight against the strength of a kingdom of Erewhon. Therefore, except for those civilians who were harmed by the undead in the border areas, in the mindset of the nobles of Erewhon, Madara was a weak, bandit country. They did not understand anything about this country, and disdained to understand it. The War of the Black Rose was a terrible nightmare for the entire kingdom of Erewhon. In fact, until now, the nobles still did not know how they lost. The previous defeat of Viro's army against the Bloodstaff was enough to explain everything. Therefore, this was a country that they knew nothing about. It was a mystery in itself. On the other hand, the huge difference between the undead and the living made it very difficult for human scouts to get close to the undead army. This problem was the most difficult problem to solve until Madara and Saint Tassel fought. Although Madara did not border the Cruz Empire on land, Little Pero and the rest of the academicians were still very clear about this. They were also very skeptical about Brando's words. Brando's confidence came from his knowledge that transcended the era. In the future, the Wind Elves had many ways to deal with these skeletons, and Karglais was taught by him personally. It was not difficult for him to bypass the Bloodstaff's army. When he was in Buchi, he personally led the refugees to escape from under the nose of Madara, and Karglais only led a few scouts to follow behind the army. This was even simpler. Needless to say, Madara in this era did not understand that there were so many loopholes in their investigative methods. Little Pero saluted the lord from afar. "Since my lord is sure that the Bloodstaff will not retreat for a while, then wait for our good news." Brando nodded, and the young men of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment pulled up the hoods of their cloaks under his gaze, turned around and left towards the south. In just a moment, only the shadows of fluttering cloaks were left in the curtain of rain. At this time, Freya had already arrived at the front of the White Lion Guards. "Brando," she shouted. "Iko has contacted us. Then let's go." Brando stood in the rain and replied in high spirits. Let the Knight of Vero understand that the times have abandoned them. Welcome to the future, this new era. Freya was slightly startled. The Shire whistled and laughed. Let's go, Freya. The Lord means that although they are useless teammates, we still have to save them. Oh. Chapter 868. The knight and his squires were fleeing under the forest. To these Vero soldiers who had never seen the world, such a scene was like the end of the world descending on everyone. It made them feel a deep fear from the bottom of their hearts, as though the fierce spirit was pouncing on them. They were alone and helpless, about to die without a burial ground in the next moment. The private soldiers were scared out of their wits and had no courage to resist. They could only throw down their weapons, scream, and flee in all directions. In the blink of an eye, they completely collapsed. The sharp claws of the Dreadwraith were like hooks hanging in the air. They swept over the heads of these soldiers and swept the knight on horseback, pulling him off his horse. The knight screamed in agony. With a crash, the lower half of his body was pulled out along with his intestines and spine. The bloody lower half of his body flew into the air and fell down. Pieces of his organs and smelly blood splattered all over the ground. The Dreadwraith let out another ear-piercing scream and flew out of the forest again. Count Jacques, the supreme commander of Vero's army, watched this scene with a pale face. 30 to 40 Dreadwraiths spread their wings that were several meters wide and drove the retainers and squires into the forest. Many of the knights were not killed by the Dreadwraith at all. Instead, they were killed by the Dreadwraith when they smashed their heads against the trees, or they were trampled to death by the Dreadwraith. This was especially true for the squires who panicked and didn't know where to run. If they were pushed to the ground, they would most likely die. The scene of 1,000 or 2,000 people being driven into the dense forest like ducks was very sad and funny. If they had the courage to stop and fight back, they might have been able to escape unscathed. However, they were already scared out of their wits. They would rather scare themselves to death than stay and fight the Dreadwraith. The noble commanders of Vero's army and the more noble knights looked at this ridiculous scene, but no one laughed. Count Jacques turned back and whispered an order. Many priests in red robes and pointed hats walked out of the forest. They held holy objects in one hand and the scriptures of the Holy Cathedral of Fire in the other. They walked along the ranks of the knights in the forest and chanted something in a low voice. Not long after, a visible white light rose from the scriptures in their hands and formed a halo. This halo gradually enveloped the entire army. Count Jacques felt as if a warm power had been injected into his heart. This power didn't bring him any practical benefits, but it had a surprisingly soothing power that made him calm down for the time being. This was the blessing of courage. The restless noble's private army in the forest also quieted down slightly under the chanting of the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. It's the halo of fear. Those screaming monsters must be higher-level undead. Jacques held the hilt of his sword and said to the others around him. Compared to his colleagues who were even paler, Count Jacques had at least experienced the War of the Black Rose. He was one of the few generals of Vero who had dealt with Madara. In this matter, Duke Vero regarded him as a trusted aide. When Her Royal Highness brought Brando's letter to her grandfather, Duke Vero let him answer. However, at that time, he was dismissive of Brando's conjecture. In his deep-rooted view, the things in the darkness in the east were just flies and dogs. During the War of the Black Rose, Madara gained an advantage purely because the kingdom did not put too much effort in the Buchi region. For example, in Karsuk, the Highland Knight did not let Madara gain too much advantage. But at this moment, Count Jacques' heart began to waver. The army of Madara in front of him was obviously different from the one he saw in Vero last year. When he was leading the army to fight against the undead army in Vero, even though he was terrified, he still remembered the first time when the swaying ribs attacked from the forest. The farmers and soldiers he recruited from the countryside almost collapsed at the first moment. Fortunately, his trusted knights were able to hold their ground, and after a series of attacks, they realized that the Madara skeletons were only SOSO. The only thing that could threaten them was the liches, but their fighting strength was only on par with the knights under the Lord's command. Of course, Count Jacques did not know that it was Frostclaw's army that invaded Vero. Frostclaw was a ghoul, just the lowest level of Madara's dark nobility. It was probably on the same level as the retainer knight under his command. When it sneaked into Vero, It was only to avoid the terrifying Highland Knight and take advantage of the situation. It had the same idea as Master Planchet, but it did not expect to run into the muzzle of Jacques' gun. The two fought a head-on battle, and it was evenly matched. Jacques lost almost all of his retainer infantry, but Frostclaw was even worse. It lost a lot of liches and was unable to recover from the setback. Not long after, it was annexed by other lords. He also did not know that the ones who invaded Bucci were the elites of Madara in the War of the Black Rose. Insursta and Tarkus were the confidants of the Supreme of Madara, and the one-eyed dragon Tarkus came from a famous family. The vampire family was the most trusted force of His Majesty the Emperor of Madara until the Battle of the Oblique Forest. And now, although the army under the Bloodstaff was not as luxurious as the combination of Insursta and Tarkus in terms of commanders, its army was in fact more powerful than the army under Insursta in the War of the Black Rose after joining the Dark Mercenaries from the Sea of the Dead Moon. This strong contrast was now clearly magnified thousands of times in Count Jacques' vision, making his mood fall from the clouds all the way to hell. Although he was still a seasoned soldier, and on the surface, he calmly said something about high-level undead creatures, but in fact, he knew in his heart that these things were only hearsay. Count Jacques' colleagues were clearly aware of his tricks, and they were not too comforted. They saw dozens of the same terrifying creatures flying out from behind the fearsome spirits that chased away the night. They swept over the gentle hillside, the forest of linden trees on the hillside, and a few low hills, heading straight in their direction. Although there was still a considerable distance between them and the fearsome spirits, they were still frightened and panicked. They were at the top of the hill facing the Churney Valley, and on the other side of the valley opposite the left wing, they were about a few miles away from the fleeing retainers and knights. On the right side, in the dense coniferous forest, elite heavy infantry were lying in ambush, protecting the crossbowmen in the center. This was originally a very beautiful blocking position. Relying on the cavalry on the left wing, they could effectively contain the undead army of Madara in this open valley of 10 to 20 miles, buying time for the Tonajal and the Lantan Islands. But now, the problem was that they had lost the ability to contain the enemy. After losing the cover of the cavalry, the heavy infantry and crossbowmen were now at the mercy of the enemy, not to mention that Madara still had air power. At this time, a famous swordsman by Duke Viro's side had identified that the fearsome spirits were at least mid-silver-ranked creatures, which meant that they were at least level 4 creatures. This made everyone's face pale. More than 100 level 4 creatures, these creatures alone could kill less than 4,000 of them. Counts Lin and Count Beauregard immediately insisted that they should retreat. Their reason was to preserve the strength of the Allied forces. If they were wiped out before the Lantan Islands, then the scene in the Silman Valley would repeat itself. But if they could at least withdraw these 4,000 men, or at least withdraw 6 out of the 12 brigades, then there would still be hope for the rest of the battle. The noble knight immediately agreed with this statement, but Count Jacques himself was sneering. He knew what these people were thinking. They said it in a dignified manner, but in fact they were just afraid of death. They thought that this was a battle that was in the bag, so they fought to be the first to participate in the battle. But once they encountered a little danger, they immediately wanted to stay out of it. Of course, Count Jacques himself also knew that he was not a noble person, so these people's thoughts were pardonable. But the question is, are these people idiots? He could not help but be angry. Do they still think that the initiative is in our hands? That they can retreat just because they want to? Thinking of this, Count Jacques could not help but become cold. At least compared to his colleagues, he was still a noble lord who knew his soldiers well. Count Jacques stabbed his sword into the ground and suddenly replied coldly, "His Grace the Duke has given us full authority to command this allied forces, so we must be loyal to our duties. You are the Duke's retainers, how can you retreat without fighting?" Count Lin was a good friend of Jacques, but he could not help but be shocked by Jacques' attitude. Could it be that this friend of his was scared out of his wits? He had seen the lunatics of the royal faction, but his friend was definitely not this kind of person. He could not help but look at Jacques strangely, wondering what this guy was trying to sell. Most of the other nobles had the same idea, but their gazes towards Count Jacques became more or less unfriendly. It was like an unspoken rule. In the current noble circle, you can be upright and plain-spoken, but if you want to harm the interests of others or even their lives, then you are destined to be an existence that cannot be tolerated by the rules. Today's nobles of Erewhon, just like Brando said, were no longer as glorious as they were in ancient times. King Eric's nobles had set an example, using their swords to plow out a kingdom in this barren land. But their descendants had long since lost their courage, and became useless people who only had schemes and power. But at this moment Jacques more or less had the same idea. He simply could not understand how could these people who he usually talked to so happily be so stupid. He coldly looked at these people and had to make things clear. How do you plan to retreat? Can you outrun the skeleton knight? Or can you outrun the monsters in the sky? A bunch of idiots. Now our only chance of survival is to hold on here and wait for the Lantonians to come and save us. Of course you can try to turn around and run, gambling on that less than 1% chance of survival, but do you have the guts? After saying this, Count Jacques could not help but let out a long sigh. He did not know why, but although he clearly felt that defeat was imminent, his heart was inexplicably carefree. He suddenly realized that compared to this group of idiots, at least he was one of the more outstanding ones. Everyone was stunned. These nobles, although most of them were Viro's retainers and knight in name, but in reality, most of them were only under the protection of their fathers. They were all well-known figures in the circle of nobles, but unfortunately war? That kind of thing was a little too far away for the Viro province. In their eyes, the most recent war was probably the dispute between Duke Viro and Count Randner. In Brando's eyes, it was not even considered a border conflict, and the scale was comparable to a village brawl. These nobles had forcibly created a few so-called famous generals. Once upon a time, Count Jacques himself was one of them, but now he could only feel his face turning red. After a while, most of these nobles confirmed Count Jacques' words from their friends or subordinates, and suddenly they were like frosted eggplants, listless. There were also a few who were so stupid that they even opened their mouths and asked if they could surrender to Madara. Of course, everyone knew that it was possible to surrender, as long as they became dead men. But this result was not something they could accept. In fact, this was one of Madara's disadvantages against the human kingdoms. Normally, when a human kingdom clashed with a human kingdom, or even any other civilized kingdom, surrendering and ransoming nobles were very common. Nobles who were captured would be treated with dignity and wait for their families to pay a price to ransom them. Then they would return to their kingdom with dignity, and they would be treated like heroes. This was common knowledge among nobles in wars. But Madara was a kingdom that did not accept living beings. Being defeated by Madara was equivalent to being killed. So in a battle against Madara, even the most cowardly army would not choose to surrender, and would often fight to the death. And now Count Jacques was left with such a choice. If he did not stay and fight, he would only be killed. There was no other way. What if the Lantan Islands don't come? They know that we have been defeated, and I think it's unlikely that they will come to die. One of the nobles could not help but ask, "How dare they not come?" replied the Count of Beauregard in a fit of anger. But after saying this, he opened his mouth and suddenly did not continue. The people present seemed to have suddenly remembered that they changed the battle plan without permission, or else they would not have fallen into such a situation. And now, not only did the Lantan Islands have a reason not to come, they could even scold them for their stupidity behind their backs. Of course, in the eyes of these nobles, this was definitely not because they had made a mistake, but because the Lantan Islands were so narrow-minded. The forest was silent for a moment. Count Jacques was worried that it would affect the morale, so he replied, "Don't worry, that Count Tonagel is very likely not to come. As far as I know, he is such a narrow-minded person. But Lantan Island's commander, Iko, I know that guy's character very well. He is an idealistic knight, and if he can come, he will definitely come to save us. Of course, the premise is that you have to be strong enough to last until then, otherwise don't blame him for coming to collect your corpses." With this explanation from Count Jacques, in addition to Iko's reputation after the Battle of Ampere-Seal, the nobles of Viro could finally breathe a sigh of relief. In fact, there were already people who praised Iko's character in private, as if the knight could hear their praise from miles away and quickly come to their rescue. With this latent hope, Count Jacques finally boosted the morale of the army a little. At this moment they were no longer fighting for victory, but purely for survival. Viro's army began to re-establish their defensive position in the Linden Forest, and their movements were quickly transmitted to the Bloodstaff through the Dreadwraith. The Dark Lords of Madara had completely calmed down by this time. At least they thought that they had figured out the details of the unknown enemy in front of them. It could only be the Lantern Islands or the Vero. Anyway, it was definitely not the Highland Knight. As for Count Tanajil? Sorry, what was that? These dark nobles from the Sea of the Dead Moon had never heard of it. The obvious good news for them was that it seemed that Lantern Island and Vero's army had no understanding of Madara at all. They were completely different from the army of Grimoires, and more similar to the army of Erwin a year ago. This kind of army, whether in the eyes of the Bloodstaff or these unruly dark mercenaries, was just trash. That was just a pile of trash. In fact, it was even worse than trash. It seems that they still have reinforcements. The black-haired young man knocked on the map and replied to the Bloodstaff, "This reinforcement should be around us. Although I don't know how these Erwin people played themselves out, they are not a threat to us. However, they don't pose much of a threat to us. Even if this pocket is closed, their combat strength alone is not worth mentioning. Moreover, these idiots have already messed up. Now we just need to eat these idiots safely." He chuckled. "They're here to provide us with a source of soldiers." The Bloodstaff also sneered. The stupidity of the Erwin people might be a little surprising to these dark mercenaries, but to the Bloodstaff it was a common occurrence. The combat strength of the white-winged cavalry of the Vermeer Legion previously surprised him. It was already a little abnormal, but this was their normal level. Its eyes stared at the pale map made of some unknown animal's skin, as if it was really looking down at the land from the sky. The undead army was advancing across a few miles. Unless the humans had sealed off the area, it was impossible for them to surround the undead army. Of course, it might have been possible, but the opponent's stupidity was pitiful. "Let's use the skeletons to test their combat strength first," it replied coldly, setting the tone of the battle. Oh! Chapter 869. The gently undulating hills were like a wrinkled carpet, and the last colors of summer had yet to fade. The grass and trees were a deep green, and there was a light drizzle. The slightly cold air seemed to have shrouded the entire battlefield in a thin layer of fog. On the hills next to the valley, many figures gradually appeared at the edge of the linden forest. They were soldiers wearing heavy armor and pointed helmets. On their right shoulder was the head of a white lion. The lion lowered its eyelids, as if it was thinking at all times, outlining the calm aura of this army. The first officers to walk out of the forest mostly had embellishments of burning demon horns on their shoulder armor, indicating that they had participated in the Battle of Ampere Seal, and had survived the bloody battle against the demons. The young man walking at the front had a pair of resolute eyes under the edge of his steel helmet. His name was Mars. Not only had he participated in the Battle of Ampere Seal, he had also experienced the calamity of wolves in the Loop of Trade Winds. There was a total of 60 young people from all over Tanajil with him, and half of them had died on the battlefield of Ampere Seal. However, he had survived and personally received a helmet with a long white mane from the Lord, becoming a platoon leader knight of the White Lion Guards. He turned his head and looked at another officer behind him. The other officer was also wearing a helmet with a metal mask, and only a pair of light brown eyes were shining with wisdom. He knew that this person was called Gasol. Although he did not participate in the Battle of Ampere Seal, he was one of the first officers to follow the Lord. Now, just like him, he was a core officer of the White Lion Guards. There were many people like him in Abes. Brando currently had 2 systems under his command. One was the original Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries, the leader of which was the Red Bronze Dragon Reto. This veteran of many years of war had long been an important figure in Tanajil. Most of his subordinates were the first batch of people to follow Brando, and now this system had a faint aura of a veteran. However, Brando had always intended to downplay the role of non-professional soldiers in Tanajil. The Red Bronze Dragon mercenaries were stationed in Abes, and now they were mainly responsible for local security in Tanajil. They were in the same position as the subterranean dwellers who were in charge of local defense. However, Reto himself was not ambitious, so he was comfortable with this arrangement. Of course, Brando's arrangement was not for the sake of power, but only to emphasize the role of professional soldiers in Tanajil in the future. No one knew better than Brando how the private armies of the old nobles were full of drawbacks. The bloody experience of Vero's army today was a bloody lesson for those who did not understand Brando's arrangement. However, they did not understand that Brando saw far more than that. He knew better than anyone else what Erwin needed. Brando's other system was the newly formed White Lion Legion and the Wind Archer Legion. This system was the future blood of Tanajil, but he did not stop his old subordinates from joining in. Many people could see that this was the true core of Brando's future. Those who were optimistic about the future of the White Lion Legion, including the mercenary commanders who were originally by Brando's side. Other than Cornelius, who was now working in the logistics department, Yuta and Rabin took the initiative to join the White Lion Legion and became the knight commanders of the 3rd and 4th platoons. These people, along with the locals of Tanajil and the youths of the royal faction who were transferred from the White Lion Legion, had become the 3 main factions in the new White Lion Legion. However, Brando hated the idea of factions, so these factions only existed on a geographical level. Gaspard noticed his colleague's gaze and turned his head. At the edge of the forest, a dense group of White Lion Legion soldiers were slowly marching out. The youths had already unsheathed their swords, and the White Lion Legion's heavy swords glinted faintly in the misty rain. The flag-bearers had yet to raise their flags, so it was impossible to see their formation. However, in the distance there were a few figures standing on horseback. "Are you nervous?" In such cold weather, Brando's breath was almost white. However, with his strength, he naturally did not need to wear a metal mask or heavy armor. He only wore a gray breastplate over his shirt, and the belt under the breastplate was tightly buckled to his waist. The emblem of a 2-headed vulture was engraved on it, and it was his new spoil of war, the crevice of Lonia. He said this to Freya, who was beside him. The future goddess of war shook her head. "It's not my first time on the battlefield, Brando," she thought to herself. However, she was so nervous in Ampere Seal that she almost couldn't hold her sword properly. After experiencing battle after battle, she gradually got used to it. She raised her head and looked forward. Her bright eyes seemed to be able to see through the haze a few miles away. "This really looks like Butchie. Uncle, Auntie, this time I'm going to drive those hateful invaders back." It was the same gentle hills of the Pine Mountain Range, and behind the rain and fog were the same enemies from that night. Freya's eyes burned with a firm belief, just like the fire that burned in Butchie that night. She unconsciously tightened her grip on the Lionheart sword in her hand. A group of figures walked out of the fog. Carglass. Miss Priestess Maria, who was beside Brando, let out a cry of relief. She was no longer dressed as a man, but had returned to her youthful appearance. Her beautiful light blonde hair made her a famous beauty in the Abbes, but it was all thanks to Carglass. Maria's father was a noble in the south of Ampere Seal. Her family had the bloodline of the Cruz people, and because of that, her father had inherited the arrogance of the empire. He had always been against the relationship between his daughter and Carglass, a poor boy from a remote village. However, after Brando's sudden rise in the kingdom, his snobbish father-in-law saw a bright future for Carglass and tacitly agreed to the marriage. Because of this, Maria and Carglass were now dead set on Brando. Carglass blushed as he looked at Maria. There were a few young people behind him, and Brando immediately saw Cohen behind them. He actually came personally. Brando was slightly surprised, but he did not show it on his face. Instead, he raised his hand and threw a helmet with a long mane and wings to Carglass. Carglass caught the helmet and replied with a cheeky smile, "Carglass reports to you, my lord. Please return to the team." He glanced at his lord, who nodded approvingly, and could not help but look at Maria, and replied with a little embarrassment, "My lord, why did you let her come too? Miss Maria is the most outstanding priestess in the territory, and the head of my priestesses. Why can't she come?" Brando replied unhappily, and then looked at the guy with a teasing gaze. "Of course, in terms of personal matters, Maria belongs to you, kid. But you can't stop her from contributing her abilities to the territory, right? Carglass, you can't be too selfish." In fact, Maria was not Brando's #1 priestess, but Hippamera was Hippamera's priestess. Under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, Erwin could only act alone, or else there would be a conflict between the churches. When Brando said this, he suddenly remembered that there was another priestess in the territory who was far superior to Maria in terms of teaching and status in the Holy Cathedral. That was the nun princess of Antoinette. However, Magadol had not fully recovered and was still recovering. Even if she was willing, Brando would not allow her to brave the harsh weather to go on an expedition to Ranner. That would be too unreasonable. When the priestess heard the second half of Brando's sentence, her face turned red. Even if Cargly's skin was as thick as a city wall, he could not help but feel a little overwhelmed. He often joked around with his lord, but the latter seemed to be above him in this aspect. It was a little unfathomable. Of course, he did not know that Brando received thousands of times more information than he did in his previous life. In terms of ability to ridicule, Brando was far better than him. The only reason he did not argue with him before was because he had not established his authority as a lord yet. Perhaps even Carglass himself did not realize that he had unknowingly acknowledged this lord, who was probably 1 or 2 years younger than him. He quickly coughed twice to cover up his embarrassment. At this time, Brando was looking at Cohen, who was behind him. The young man was thinner than when he first met him. His cheeks were deeply sunken, but his dark eyes were deeper and sharper, and his whole person was more tenacious. He was wearing a thick animal skin cloak, and his temperament was somewhat similar to little Perro's. It had only been half a year since they last met, and he had grown a lot taller. He was still a teenager before, but now he had the demeanor of a master. "It's been a long time, Count." Cohen was the first to speak. He was previously interested in the banter between Brando and his subordinates, but he was very surprised by the relationship between them. He was born in the mines under Ranner's rule, and he was used to the exploitation of the lower class by the old nobles of Erewhon. He hated the nobles and bureaucrats, and he had no good feelings for them. Like all those who had ambitions since they were young, Cohen dared to put his hatred into action. But in the end, it was difficult for the future king of Ranner to see beyond this era. Although he yearned for equality and freedom, it was difficult for him to imagine a world that truly respected equality between people. Therefore, it was even more difficult for him to understand Brando, who was a freak among the nobles. It seems that this Count Tonagel is indeed a maverick like the rumors say. But I don't know if it's because of his personality, or if it's just a pretense. In fact, he already had an answer in his heart. After all, Brando had once helped all of them in the underworld of Schaflund, and this lord had left a deep impression on him. He was different from the treacherous nobles, who valued promises and kept them. He had the demeanor of the ancient nobles. Cohen did not simply hate the nobles, but he hated the upper class of the kingdom that stood in the way of corruption. Every citizen of Erewhon had a yearning for King Brando's beliefs, and Cohen was no exception. The appearance of a noble like Brando gave him a kind of inspiration. Perhaps this was the person he was looking for. The future king of Ranner's thoughts were extremely complicated, but he did not show it on his face. He looked at Brando. Brando already had some guesses in his heart, but he still could not believe it. The future king of Ranner's territory wanted to submit to him? He was almost overwhelmed by the unexpected favor. In Brando's view, someone like Cohen who was able to jump from being a refugee to the ruler of a territory was definitely one of those legendary people who were born with great ambitions. If it was not for the fact that Erewhon's territory was too small, Cohen's future achievements would not be limited to this. If such a person was placed in the history of his homeland in his previous life, he would be the founder of a dynasty. Such a person actually wanted to submit to him. Ever since Brando transmigrated to this world, this was the first time he felt that he was overflowing with the aura of a king. However, he quickly regained his composure. The current Cohen was not the future king of Ranner. He was only a bandit leader, and had not encountered many opportunities in history. Moreover, because of Brando's existence, it was very likely that he would not be able to encounter such opportunities in his lifetime. The reason why Cohen did not submit to him in Schaflund was because he was only a bandit leader at that time, and did not attract Cohen's attention. Secondly, Cohen did not have as many thoughts as he did now. He was only a youth who wanted to go out of Schaflund and see the wider world. But in just half a year, the youth's heart had changed greatly. It seemed that the wider world had indeed changed his life. "Thank you very much for everything you've done for the Silman region in this war, Mr. Cohen. Sometimes birth does not mean everything. Nobles are never born with superiority. There are many capable people everywhere, and you happen to be the most outstanding one among them," Brando flatly praised. "There are some people whose starting line is far ahead of you. They were sheltered by their parents, but now they are far behind you. Mr. Cohen, when the ancient nobles plowed the borders of this kingdom with their swords, their birth was never determined by the heavens. There are only two words: faith and struggle. Cohen's eyes lit up. This was what he had been searching for all this time. Brando's words seemed to confirm the doubts in his heart. He almost suspected that Brando had some kind of ability to see through people's hearts. He looked at Brando with an incredulous gaze. In fact, the future king of Ranner did not guess wrongly. Brando did indeed have some kind of ability that could see through his heart. In history, Cohen had always been pursuing the glory of the ancient nobles. This was also the dream that every citizen of Erewhon yearned for. However, most people could only dream about it in their hearts, but Cohen dared to put it into action. Brando knew what the king of Ranner was thinking, so he naturally would not be wrong. However, he was still a little worried. After all, the person in front of him was different from the one in history. Perhaps his views on life and likes and dislikes had already changed? However, Cohen's expression allowed him to heave a sigh of relief. Fortunately, even though Won's history is in chaos, there are still some details that cannot be changed. He thought that he had managed to convince the other party. Silman is an important gateway to the kingdom's southern border. You've seen what it will become in the future. To the south of here is a dark kingdom. An empire is slowly rising there, and it will be the kingdom's most terrifying enemy in the future. Mr. Cohen, the things that you can do today are far more than what you have done today. Cohen calmed himself down and shook his head. I'm just a fugitive, Count. What I've done today is far from being as noble as you say it to be. I only did it to return your favor. Mr. Cohen, there's no need to belittle yourself. Freya could also tell that there was something going on between the two of them. She wholeheartedly fought to protect the ideals of Butchie, and the other half of her heart was tied to Brando. She knew that Brando wanted to subdue the young man in front of her. She did not need to ask why Brando did what he did, and she had already spoken out to persuade him. However, Cohen only glanced at the female knight in front of him and shook his head. He did not say anything. Brando knew that the pompous words that Freya learned from the Royal Knight Academy were useless against this ambitious young man. Those words would only work on a simple-minded girl like Freya. He looked at Cohen and replied, "You and I are both fugitives. For the sake of the kingdom and the beliefs in our hearts, everything else is insignificant. Why do you care about those complicated formalities?" Cohen thought for a moment and did not refute. He nodded slightly and stood to the side. Brando knew that he was moved, so he did not pursue the matter. This person was a true hero, and his background was very similar to his own. If he chose to side with him, then he could only stand with him. Looking at the entire kingdom, other than him, no one would treat these people the same way. In fact, if it was not for the support of the princess and his identity as the grandson of Sword Saint Darius, he might not have been able to hold his own in the kingdom. The rejection of the commoners by the nobles was deeply ingrained. Brando ignored the drizzle and asked Carglass, "Tell me, what's the situation now? Is Count Jacques dead or alive? How many of Viro's soldiers are left?" Carglass' spirits were lifted and he immediately replied, "Tormo is a man. Although his retainer knights were a little stupid and almost killed the Viro people Marcia above, I have never seen such a tragic defeat. That was just a joke. But my lord, it's a miracle that Uncle Tomo did not let his men escape. Madara is really scary." He could not help but shudder at the mention of Madara. Ever since the Battle of Ampere-Seal, everyone thought highly of the White Lion Guards and did not take Madara seriously. Although Brando had mentioned more than once how scary the Roman Rose was in Carglass' mind, the undead army was only scary in comparison to Erewhon's old army. In his opinion, the undead army could easily sweep through the private armies of the nobles, but they were nothing in front of the White Lion Guards. The White Lion Guards had once faced the demon army head-on in the Battle of Ampere-Seal. No matter how scary the undead were, they were not as famous as the demons, who were widely recognized as the strongest in terms of individual combat power. However, he couldn't help but feel refreshed by what he had seen today, and his reverence for his lord deepened a little. In fact, every general who encountered the undead army for the first time would have the same thought as Carglass. Individually, the undead might not be as terrifying as the demons, but once they were united into an army, they would be one of the most terrifying armies in the world. This was an army that was silent. They would not scream out of fear, nor would they run away because of injuries. They would not give up unless they suffered 100% loss. They would not despair, nor would they be excited. They would only move forward and devour everything in their path. As for their opponents, they would never be able to feel the so-called advantage of bravery from these skeletons, because even if they were imposing, it would be meaningless in the face of a group of wooden men. They would still have to kill each and every one of them one by one, crushing them into pieces in order to obtain victory. The winner of a battle with the undead would feel mentally and physically exhausted, while the loser would feel nothing because they had already become part of the Black Rose. The Roman rose would never wither, as if it was eternal. Oh. Chapter 870. Carglass suppressed the nervousness in his heart and told them everything he saw. After the Viro's left wing was defeated, Count Jacques set up a defensive formation in a forest, hoping to use the terrain to restrict the Madara's skeletal cavalry and fear wraiths. After losing their left flank, the Viro's defensive line became extremely narrow, and they were surrounded by the undead army on 3 sides. Madara sent skeleton swordsmen to attack, but the Viro's elite crossbowmen were almost useless against the skeletons. Only the arrows that were sanctified by the priests of the Holy Cathedral of Fire had an effect, but their numbers were too small to affect the battle at all. The skeleton swordsmen were slightly weaker than the human soldiers, but they had the advantage in numbers. Viro's elite crossbowmen could not do much, and the remaining 1,000 knights and heavy infantrymen were in a difficult battle. Just like any other human army that fought against the undead, the Viro people's resistance was extremely tenacious. The dark nobles of Madara were used to this, and their method of dealing with the Viro people was very simple. They would exchange casualties with the Viro people regardless of the cost. Brando knew that Count Jacques was doomed. The skeletons were resistant to arrows, and the Viro's army did not bring enough priests with them. It was a suicide mission. On the other hand, Madara's undead army was tireless and unaffected by casualties, but the humans could not accept the despair of seeing their comrades fall one by one. As expected, the Viro's army quickly fell into chaos. So the Viro's army is almost done for? Brando asked. Almost done for, my lord. However, Madara's infantrymen are still involved. The Viro's elite crossbowmen are not much of a threat to the skeletons, but they are a great threat to the Dreadwraiths. The Bloodstaff lost 2 Dreadwraiths in this battle, and they are probably determined to take down the Viro's elite army. Moreover, the current exchange is very advantageous to them, and they have no reason to let go of this opportunity. You saw it with your own eyes? I saw it with my own eyes, my lord. Then what do you think of both sides? Brando sat on the horse and asked pointedly. Viro's knight retainers are a joke. In my opinion, they shouldn't have come at all. Those knights really made Count Jacques suffer. If it weren't for them, Viro wouldn't have lost so miserably. Duke Viro can't stop them from coming. Brando smiled, his tone mocking. The people around him couldn't help but frown, especially Carglass, who was born in a noble family. It was natural for a retainer to serve their lord. Aween and Kurlutz had maintained this tradition for the past few centuries, and it didn't seem to be a big deal. But why did it suddenly seem like a huge drawback? Only Brando knew in his heart that in the past, it didn't matter who won or lost in the battles between lords. At most they would lose some money. That was a war between nobles. But from this era onwards, wars of annexation of countries and territories had begun. From this moment on, the outcome of a war was related to life and death. The inefficient way of forming an army had begun to become a fatal weakness. What about the others? They're all right. Count Tommel's noble knight and heavy infantry have the strength of Ampere-Seal's harbor guards and the Southern Legion, but their numbers are too small. If the elite crossbowmen were able to do their job, they might be able to put up a fight, but now... Carglass clicked his tongue. Count Tommel was Count Jacques' real name. Carglass had always been frivolous, so he lacked the necessary courtesy to the nobles other than Brando and the princess. Calling him by his name and not giving him a nickname was already a show of respect for the Count's courage. What he meant by putting up a fight was that they could only fight the 4,000 skeletons head-on. The Bloodstaff did not even send their elites to the battlefield. What about the Lantonians? Eek was stopped by the skeletons of Madara. They're right in front of us. They've been trying to support Count Tommel, but the skeletons didn't give them the chance. But the Lantonians are really strong. They didn't let them have the upper hand. I saw Eek and his knights circling around the skeletons. They're probably waiting for us to arrive at the battlefield. Brando smiled. The commander of this army must be Eek's fiancée Yura. That blind girl with 9 phoenixes was a genius. She was a true chosen one. If it weren't for her and Eek's early deaths in history, Erwin's history might have turned out differently. At that time there were several strong people in the south. Other than Eek and Yura, there was also Cohen in front of him. If the 3 of them could work together with the Highland Knight, Madara's invasion might not have been so smooth. When the Bloodstaff was ambushed in Tosankade Forest, Yura played an important role in it. Tell me about Madara. He deliberately raised his voice. As expected, everyone pricked up their ears. Other than Brando, most of the people here were very curious about the opponent that their lord had always valued. From what they heard, the skeletons were not worth mentioning. Other than Brando and Freya, even the mercenaries who escaped from Bucci did not think that Madara would be Erwin's greatest enemy. These people were more or less influenced by such thinking. But today they seemed to have seen the other side of the Roman rose. Janna was sitting on the saddle in full armor. She was not used to the heavy armor she was wearing, but she loved it so much that she could not put it down. The beautiful armor that was decorated with embellishments now proved that she was a noble of the kingdom. She was the head knight, and this was the position she had always wanted. If she had this position earlier, perhaps she would have been able to protect her sister. She sighed inwardly. When she heard Brando's words, Yuta pursed her lips again. She turned to Vern and said, "Our lord is here again." The knight captain of the Karsuk cavalry glanced at her coldly and did not answer. "Are those skeletons really that powerful?" "More powerful than you think, but not as ridiculous as our lord said," Vern replied. "I think so too. Our lord must have been frightened by them in Bucci. Haha, although our lord is a little unbelievably powerful, young and handsome, he is still a child after all." Yuta smiled. Vern glanced at her. It was a little too disrespectful to say that. Every Karsuk citizen had a blood feud with the Bloodstaff, and he was no exception. He was grateful that his lord kept his promise and brought him here. When he thought of the opportunity to kill the Bloodstaff with his own hands, the head of the Karsuk cavalry felt his blood boiling. Of course he might agree with Yuta's words, but he would never describe his lord that way. At this moment in front of Brando, Carglass was silent for a moment. "If I can, I really don't want to be their enemy. To deal with them I have to kill them completely. Just thinking about it makes me tired." "That's it? It's a little strong." "Strong?" "There was a group of skeleton swordsmen that defeated Uncle Tormobo. Their attire is something I have never seen before. Their strength is far beyond the average skeleton. But the strange thing is that we have never heard of this kind of skeleton swordsman before. I suspect that other than the Dread Race and the skeleton cavalry, Madara has many other high-grade military units that we have never heard of before. They have never appeared in the past wars." Carglass replied. "Describe them." The skeleton swordsmen were a little different from the ordinary skeletons. They used two-handed swords that were as wide as a palm. "Two-handed swordsmen." "Yes, two-handed swordsmen." Carglass nodded. They were also different from the ordinary skeletons. They wore black half-body armor without a helmet. They seemed to be wearing iron gauntlets. "Is there a carving of a spider on the breastplate of the half-body armor?" Carglass raised his head and looked at Brando in surprise. "My lord, you have seen them before?" "The spider swordsman is here, as expected." He looked at Carglass and continued to ask, "And then?" "They are very strong." Carglass was a little surprised. He knew his mission before he went to Silman. Other than the knowledge that Brando taught him about Madara, he also borrowed information about the Kingdom of Darkness from Amandina. But he did not find any information about the strange two-handed swordsman. He felt that his lord was a little unusual, so he answered cautiously, "An ordinary knight is no match for them. They have the strength of a third-grade army." "A third-grade army?" Rabin could not help but exclaim. "That's impossible." Madara indeed had many high-grade undead creatures. Among them, the bone dragon was a 9th-grade creature. There were a total of 3 bone dragons in the Insursta Dragon's army, but they were like generals in Erwin's army. Once they appeared on the battlefield, they were often conspicuous targets. Erewhon also had elemental awakened masters, so when these high-grade undead creatures appeared on the battlefield, they would not be able to cause much damage to an ordinary army. In Won's military theory, only high-grade undead could be called a high-grade army. However, Madara and Erewhon lacked high-grade armies. Their basic army was made up of skeletons and zombies, which were even inferior to human soldiers. The higher-grade army was made up of the Black Knight and the Ghost. The Pale Horsemen were also a type of ghost, but their numbers were too few. If it were not for the unique attributes of the undead, Madara's army would not even be as strong as Erewhon's. For this reason, for thousands of years, both sides were able to fight back and forth, and at one point the kingdom even had the upper hand. That was why Rabban, who had dealt with the skeletons the most, was the first to feel incredulous when he heard Karglai's words. But if Madara has such an army, why did they hide it before? If they wanted to catch us off guard, now is not the time to do so. Yuta could not help but ask. Brando shook his head. This was the general mentality of the people of Erewhon in this era. Even the people around him did not know what was happening in the east. But only he knew that Karglai's was not lying. Madara had never hidden its army, and there was no need for it to hide anything from a weak country like Erewhon. However, it was true that the Spider Swordsmen had never appeared in the war against Erewhon before, because they had just joined Madara's army. The Dread Wraiths, the Skeleton Knights, and now the Spider Swordsmen. Although today's Madara did not have the Tamar of history, it still had these new types of soldiers. One person's gains and losses could not change history. Madara's huge territory in all four directions was too terrifying. And there would be more in the future. This was just the beginning. Brando smiled. If he told these people that the Spider Swordsmen would become Madara's basic infantry in the future, what would they think? After the Third War of the Black Rose, Madara did not bother to create any more skeleton warriors. It was a pure waste of soul energy. From then on, Madara's lowest level soldier was the vengeful Spider Swordsman, which had evolved into a 4th-grade soldier. So all of you have heard it, Brendel said. The enemy you will face in front of us might be an undead army with a 3rd-tier army and a 4th-tier air force. This is an army that is different from the Crews, the Lion Clan, and even the demons. You will soon see the power of this army. The young White Lion guards fell silent after hearing their lord's words. Brando looked at everyone at the border of the forest and waved his hand gently. But these are not important. He suddenly smiled, revealing his white teeth. What's important is that we will crush them here today. And tell the world that today's enemy of Madara will be a kingdom that has lost its ancient glory and returned to this world from the long scroll of history. It is the White Lion, the Golden Sword, the Oath of Protection, and the Ancient Faith. Yes, the Count rode on his horse. He paused for a moment, as if he was about to exhale the last breath in his chest. Our country, Erewhon. His voice was not loud, as if it was drifting in the rain, but it made the blood in everyone's chest surge in reverse, as if it had given birth to endless courage. It made everyone feel as if they could not help but let out a long cry and move forward with their swords. Brando raised his hand. On the river valley, on the border of the forest, the flag-bearers raised their flags. The sacred white flag fluttered in the wind and appeared in the mist, flapping loudly. On it was the kingdom's new moon, the pine mountains, the fallen leaves, and the ice and snow of the northern region. It was as if the history of the kingdom had been reborn on this land at this moment. On it was the emblem of the White Lion. The trumpeter put the trombone to his lips, puffed up his cheeks, and blew hard. The sound of the horn was melodious, as if it had broken through the mist. Who's in front of us? Brando suddenly asked. It's the 2 regiments from the Sea of the Dead Moon. I've already figured it out. The commanders are Death Whisperer Mawkin and Serviskag the Silent. The troop composition is basically Spider Swordsmen, and there are a few skeleton cavalry. They should be the elites of the Blood Staff. It has nothing to do with the Blood Staff. It's the Emperor's chosen group. Brando smiled. The Emperor's chosen group? It's nothing. Let's run over them first, as a greeting to the Blood Staff. The melodious trombone echoed throughout the entire valley. The first to react was the Lantanilan. As soon as he heard the thick and heavy sound of the dragon's horn, Eek's eyes lit up. He tightened his grip on the reins and turned around on the galloping horse. He turned around and shouted, "Listen! Where is the sound coming from?" The Knight of Anthony turned around and after a moment, someone replied loudly, "It's the west, the west! Haha, the Tanajo people are here." Eek pulled out his sword, turned his horse around and shouted, "The Count is greeting the Bloodstaff. We, the people of Anthony, can't let them look down on us. Let's go, let's blow the horn too. Get ready to turn around. It's time to teach those half-assed skeleton cavalry a lesson." Being chased by a group of opponents who were much weaker than them to the point that they did not dare to fight back, the knight had long been aggrieved. At this moment they could not help but cheer loudly, and for a moment, the river valley was filled with a tsunami of cheers. The humming of the horns echoed each other and spread throughout the valley along with the wind and rain. Count Jacques, whose face was covered in blood, raised his head and listened carefully to the sound of the horns. "The Tanajo people are here. They and the people of Anthony are informing us." This resolute soldier could not help but shed tears at this moment. 2 streams of hot blood flowed down from the bloodstains on his face, and he lamented, "But what's the use of them coming? It's useless. I've let them down. I've let them down. Quickly retreat. We're hopeless. At least don't all die here. Go and tell Her Highness the Princess. Tell the Duke Madara is no longer Madara. Where's the trumpeter? Quickly tell them to retreat. Retreat quickly, before the undead have their eyes on them." The trumpeter stood beside his lord in a daze, and everyone could not help but look at each other. Should they blow the horn? If the horn was blown, then they were doomed, and no one would come to their rescue. They were surrounded, and only death was awaiting them. But what if they blew the horn? As the Count said, what was the use of that? The undead army in front of them was no longer what it used to be, and even the people of Anthony could not break through their defense line, so what were the Tanajo people? That place was just a remote place, and perhaps the current lord would be a powerful minister of the kingdom in the future, and he might even become the only sword saint in the new generation of Erewhon, but so what? One person could not change the situation of the war. But to wait for death, the nobles could not do it. Logic told them that they should blow the horn, but emotionally, these cowardly nobles could not accept the fate of being abandoned by their allies. They could not help but look at the trumpeter and shake their heads desperately. Everyone, Count Jacques certainly noticed the little movements of his colleagues. Even at this time, they still could not let go of their little thoughts. He could not help but sigh in his heart and said somewhat weakly, "Everyone still has children. Do you want them to face the same situation as us today, waiting for death in despair and sorrow? You are soldiers and the word duty may be too distant for you, but protecting your wife and children is a human instinct. I've said all I can. Do you still want to stop me?" Count Slin, who was shaking his head desperately, suddenly froze. Children and descendants were the hope of the nobles' inheritance. Even if they were as cold as iron, they could not help but waver at this moment. Under the same sky, the Bloodstaff was silently looking at the gloomy sky, as if it could see the sound of the trombone reverberating in the air. After a while it lowered its head and asked in a low voice, "Where is this army from?" The human wounded soldiers who did not die said that they seemed to be from Tanajo. Tanajo? The Bloodstaff was slightly startled. "Where is that?" "I'm very sorry, I have not heard of it, my lord." "Oh." Chapter 871. The 2,000 undead army immediately got into formation on the shallow riverbank. The spider swordsmen in black stood next to each other in a row. They were wearing armor with spider patterns on their chests. They took a step forward in unison and held their palm-wide black greatswords with both hands. They placed the blades flat and pointed the tip of the sword to the ground. One of their hands held the hammer at the same level as their chests while the other hand held the hilt of the sword with the palm facing up. Their bodies leaned forward and formed a certain angle with the sword. The 2,100 skeletons maintained this posture at the same time. Rows of greatswords were put down one after another in the cold rain. The cold light on the edges of the swords formed a line that looked like the sharp teeth of death. A small group of black knights surrounded Serviskag. This dark noble lord nicknamed the Silencer was also wearing the armor of a black knight. However, he did not wear a helmet. A pale head was exposed above the breastplate. The few strands of hair on his head were like weeds in the wind. His face was covered with dried livor mortis, and his eyes were burning with pale flames. His entire body was emitting a cold aura of death. He held the hilt of his sword that was inlaid with black roses with one hand. Just like his nickname, he silently looked to the west. That was the undulating riverbank and hills. The rain formed a thin mist that blocked the view. Behind the mist, the dark forest stood like a wall. However, suddenly holy white flags appeared in the forest. Under the flags there was a group of human infantry marching. Their silver-gray armor reflected the light as they moved up and down. A trace of doubt flashed in Serviskag's eyes. He had never heard of this army. However, the other party's equipment was excellent. It was obvious that they were not a random army. 500 meters was a distance where both sides could only observe each other quietly. No shields. Light infantry. The size is about 5 companies. Serviskag calculated the size of the army in front of him. For someone like him, this was not a skill. There were more than 400 autonomous regions and small states in the Sea of the Dead Moon. They lacked everything except soldiers, especially experienced soldiers. They were the best mercenaries in the entire Dark World. They had experienced hundreds of battles and were sensitive to war. 1.5 companies. She was relieved. The pride of the Black Rose in her soul flame took over again. She could not help but feel a little disdainful. Spider swordsmen were the nemesis of light infantry and cavalry. As long as there were no heavy cavalry, they were the most terrifying force on the battlefield. Furthermore, the enemy's numbers were far inferior. Serviskag smiled coldly. He thought to himself that these arrogant human nobles must still be adhering to the rules and holding on to the creed that infantrymen were only defensive forces. However, they must not know that infantrymen could also bare their fangs and become a sharp blade that could tear apart a battlefield. Let the Queen of Spiders tell you that your era is over. The Black Knight took another look at Erwin's army. The White Lion Guards were slowly advancing, and he was even more certain of this. At this moment, sparks of light began to appear on the other side of the river. They're casting spells. There's a group of magicians. The Black Knight's muffled conversation made Serviskag raise his sparse eyebrows slightly. The army opposite them was really not ordinary. If there was a group of magicians, then it was at least an army on the level of the Vermeer Legion. The other party was very likely to be part of the Central Legion, and not some noble's army. However, he did not know which legion it was. He frowned and muttered in his heart. Wasn't the Southern Legion already near Ampere Seal? Which legion did this army in front of him come from? The sparks of magic gradually became denser. Serviskag's expression finally changed. With this scale, could it be Erwin's Royal Knight Regiment, or a part of the Black Blade Squad or the White Lion Legion? Impossible. These 3 elite units of Erwin would not come to the south unless they had completely abandoned the area north of Ampere Seal. He shook his head and muttered in his heart. The army in front of him was too strange. Although there were liches in Madara's army, liches were not considered wizards. He had never seen such a group of magicians before. Even in the history of Wonde after the War of the Holy Saints, such a group of magicians had never appeared before. 1,500 infantrymen accompanied by more than 100 magicians. This is crazy. Serviskag thought that either the enemy was crazy or he was hallucinating. The sound of horns echoed on the battlefield. Viro's people want us to turn around and retreat, Brando said to Cohen, Carglass and Freya who were beside him. Looks like they still have some conscience. At least it proves that the people we want to save are not all useless, Carglass replied with a grin. Cohen did not say a word. This was the first time the young man from Schafland had personally participated in a battle. The scene in front of him was different from what he had imagined. The White Lion Legion was moving slowly in the drizzle, and he heard orders from time to time. Unsheath your swords. Advance in formation. When the young men from Tonajul had just left the forest, their formation was still a little messy. However, after 100 meters, they had already formed a well-defined formation. The sergeants and heralds on horseback galloped in front and behind the formation, flags flying in the air. This army was completely different from the armies of the nobles that he had seen before. He had a vague feeling that this army had come from a certain period of history and had come to this battlefield. That period of history was called the establishment of Erwin. He subconsciously looked back and saw Brando standing on horseback with a sword in his hand. He looked up at his own army with a calm expression on his face. This army is just SOSO in his eyes, Cohen thought. What kind of army does this Earl want? Brando smiled softly. The White Lion Legion had begun to take shape, and Erwin had taken its first step. Now what he wanted to see was to open the door with his own hands. Behind the golden door was another era. In the previous period of history, it had begun in the Year of Silver. In this period of history, it would begin today. After today, it would be the future. He raised his head and looked at the slender figure in the rain. At the same time, Freya also looked back in the direction of Brando. She was riding a snow-white warhorse, and her heart was filled with doubts. What is Brando trying to do? This is not how mages should be used. In Erwin's tactical manual, it was clearly written that the precious mages must be protected with the utmost care. Mages with more than 100 mages must be protected by a legion. Otherwise, they should be dispersed to avoid being destroyed. Magicians were a precious auxiliary force that could sometimes even change the outcome of a battle. Adepts had extremely strong individual combat abilities, and were one of the stronger individuals on the battlefield. In normal battle tactics, such individuals with strong combat abilities should be scattered throughout the army. This way they could be effectively protected and could also pose an effective threat to the enemy's formations and commanders at various points. But now, Tanagel's mages were arranged in a phalanx like the infantry. Only a small number of White Lion Legion guards were outside the phalanx. Their chanting resounded throughout the riverbank like a hymn. Light floated in the air, and layers of spells were cast on the White Lion Legion guards in front of them. Carglass raised his head and looked at the colorful halos that fell from the sky together with the rain. They fell on every soldier, including himself. He curiously touched the layer of energy barrier that was a few inches away from his body. It was as if there was a layer of air flowing around his fingertips, forming a whirlpool. It was the wind shield. What a spectacular sight! Carglass muttered to himself. Allocating so many wizards to an army of only 1,500 was opposed by almost everyone, especially Amandina and Medisha. Amandina advised Brando to cherish this rare force because of the difficulty of training wizards in the territory. Amandina, on the other hand, had experience from the War of the Holy Saints and was not optimistic about Brando's decision. Most of the others, including Freya, were against this decision as well. Tanagel had many wizards, but most of them came from mercenary groups, witches, and druids in the loop of trade winds. They were not the reserve force of the territory, which meant that once they were lost, it would be difficult to replace them. In everyone's opinion, this rare group of wizards should be used carefully as a secret force of Tanagel. However, Brando stood his ground and put them together to form this group of wizards. Carglass even heard that even Seal was not optimistic about the future of this mage group. The Kurlutzians who followed Veronica even said that this was a move of a nouveau riche. But was Lord Carglass a nouveau riche? Carglass looked at Brando's calm face and rubbed his chin. Alright. Maybe. But no matter what, the buffs provided by the group of more than 200 wizards were enough to cover an entire army. When the buffs were cast on every single member of the White Lion squad, it was indeed a spectacular sight. My Lord Carglass' decision seems to be wise. Yuta took one last look at the other side of the river and pulled down her metal mask. Her voice was muffled in the rain. Rabin, who was not far away, shook his head. He pulled out his sword and slowly walked forward with his men. He was slightly worried. It was not that no one had ever done this before, but the effect was limited. The enemy would spread out their formation, making the spell less effective. Even if one or two groups of wizards were defeated, the loss of precious wizards would be far greater than the loss of the enemy. It was not worth it. Over time no one dared to do this. But what was the Lord Carglass thinking? Brando looked at Carglass' curious face and knew what he was thinking. What do you think wizards are, Carglass? He asked. The latter hurriedly pulled down his metal mask. Even though it was a little impolite, he guessed that Brendel had seen him snickering and he stammered, My lord, the tactical manual says, don't joke around, Carglass. You're not a professional. Don't talk to me about tactical drill. Tell me what you think. Brando replied impatiently. My lord, I really don't know. Carglass shook his head. He was not a wizard, so how could he know what a wizard would do? There were rumors in the countryside that wizards were all-powerful and omnipotent, but these rumors could not be trusted. But Princess Medisha, she Brando sneered at Erwin's old tactical drill, but he did not necessarily agree with Medisha. The War of the Holy Saints could be said to be the largest war in the world since the destruction of Babel Fortress. In that war, there were Frost Knights, Dragon King's cavalry, Myrna's Dusksong Guards, and the Silver Elf Princess Guards. That war was as magnificent as an epic, but there were no wizards in that war. The history of wizards began with Tumen. Tumen taught magic to the Silver Folk, and from him, Wonde had its first generation of wizards. However, it was not until the Buga Empire's prosperity that the history of wizards began to shine brightly. During the War of the Holy Saints, these stealers of laws were just a fledgling force. They were as weak as fledglings that had just broken out of their shells. In a battle of that level, all they could do was look up to the Holy Saints. The history of wizards' participation in the war was even later. The collapse of the Holy Alliance directly led to the Buga Empire's withdrawal from worldly affairs. The Silver Elves retreated into the Deep Valley, and the era of mortals came. Many years later, the rules of war had truly changed. What was a wizard? Many people thought that wizards were the power to change the situation on the battlefield. Their strange spells could bring unexpected changes to the whole war. They could turn the hard ground into mud, make dry battlefields suddenly rain, ignite fires in forests, build forts and fortresses in an instant, and provide endless help and protection to friendly forces. But they all overlooked one thing: the other side of wizards: destructive power. Wizards represent firepower, Brando said to Carglass, who stood proudly in the rain. It is a power that can dominate the battlefield. This statement was not much different from the previous one. Carglass did not understand what firepower meant, but he understood what Brando was trying to say. He did not think much of it, but he still replied in a muffled voice, "Wizards have limited magic power, my lord. Moreover, their enemies are alive. Didn't Lady Veronica say that it is a waste to use the wizard's precious spells to kill scattered enemies?" This was indeed a problem. After all, this was not the era of the great demonic wave. But that was a matter for the future. Today, the wizards under his command were more than enough to deal with the skeletons. Brando thought back to the Battle of Oblique Forest and the miracle that the wizards had created. He smiled coldly. Soon, the same miracle would befall the skeletons of Madara. Tanajal's wizard apprentices had practiced this battle thousands of times, but even they did not know what it would bring. They only knew that when it shone, everyone would be deeply shocked. The two sides were now 150 yards away from each other. Erwin's men began to blow the cornet, and the White Lion Guards began to speed up. But they were still orderly. The officers on horseback also dismounted and joined their ranks. They raised their swords and commanded their men to prepare for the charge. At this moment, Brando's eyes flashed. He glanced at Madara's long formation. The skeletons were indeed scattered. As expected of the Emperor's chosen group from the Sea of the Dying Moon, they lived up to their name. When both sides were within 100 yards of each other, the liches under Sir Viscag began to cast spells on the spider swordsmen. They were very calm, or rather, their commander was very calm, because there was no such thing as being calm in the first place. "They are faster than expected," Viscag said to his men. "There is something strange about this army." The White Lion Guard's strange shoulder armor had already entered their vision. With the support of magic, the speed of this Trentheim infantry, whose average standard was only at the peak of Iron rank, was already close to the starting speed of light cavalry. Viscag suddenly gritted his teeth. He realized that the army in front of him was not defensive infantry. Like his spider swordsmen, they were infantry that was used to attack. "What do they look like?" He turned around and asked. "A bit like the legendary White Lion Legion," a Black Knight replied in a muffled voice. "No, they are not." Viscag shook his head. "That's not right." It was a pity that he did not have any skeleton archers. Otherwise, he could have tested them. But it did not matter. This was the Emperor's chosen group from the Sea of the Dying Moon, an army personally selected by His Majesty the Supreme Emperor. They were equipped with the most elite undead soldiers and commanders in Madara. No matter who was in front of them, there was only one ending, and that was to be crushed. She gestured for the Black Knight to raise the flag and pass the message to the liches in the army. The entire formation was more spread out. The open terrain of the riverbank was advantageous to them because they had more troops. At this moment, A flash of light suddenly flashed in the rain in front of them. It's here, Serviscag thought. Count Jacques saw hundreds of golden lines cut through the rain from the top of the mountain. Those blazing flames were like streams of molten steel. They intertwined with each other, then disappeared and flashed again, one after another. It was as beautiful as the fireworks at the Winter Zither festival. Everyone was so surprised that they were almost speechless. Mages! Someone shouted. The Tanajul people have so many mages. The count looked back at the others. The nobles of Viro looked at each other. How could they use mages like this? Was that Count Tanajul a nouveau riche? Everyone had the same thought in their hearts. The fireballs fell on the riverbank like raindrops, causing an effect that was beyond everyone's imagination. The soft soil on the riverbank seemed to have been injected with life and came alive. Pieces of it were churning and being lifted up, forming a scene that was like the end of the world. Even the sergeants of the White Lion Legion were almost stunned by the scene in front of them. The terrifying explosion plowed through Viscag's front line. The skeleton swordsmen there were already scattered, and now they were even more scattered. After a round of fire, a sieve-like position appeared in front of the White Lion Legion. At this moment, Freya seemed to have a flash of lightning in her heart as she realized something. Serviscag also realized the problem. This round of magic attacks did not destroy his army. In fact, the damage caused was very limited. Although there were casualties, it was negligible compared to the magic consumption of the enemy mages. However, the problem was that after the magic attacks there was still a White Lion Legion in front. He had thought that they were just infantry, and would not be able to enter the position so quickly. However, the enemy's speed was beyond imagination. They were not infantry at all. They were the damned cavalry that did not need to ride horses. They were the real White Lion Legion in history. Quick! Viscag suddenly screamed. Let the rear line go up. Don't let them cut into the front line so quickly. Don't let them run. However, at this moment the second round of magic attacks came. Brando's gaze fell on the Shire. The Shire pondered for a moment and gave the order to attack. Under everyone's stunned gazes, the mage's spells extended forward and landed on the position between the spider swordsman's front line and the second line. Now it was just a piece of empty land. The Viro people behind Count Jacques were scared out of their wits. Why are the Tanajul people attacking the empty land? Are they crazy? Do the mages not have any mana? Count Lin suddenly stopped talking because he saw countless fear wraiths suddenly fly out from the Bloodstaff's formation and rush towards the west side of the river. Those monsters seemed to cover the sky and the sun as they rushed out in full force. The Bloodstaff has realized the problem. Count Jacques looked at this scene and replied dryly. The two regiments in the south are done for. What? At this moment there was a loud whistle on the river bank. The magic effects were far from over, but Freya had already raised her longsword and gave her first command in this war. Charge! Oh! Chapter 872. Charge! The longsword was raised in the rain, and the mist was like an arc of silver light. Freya raised the sacred Lionheart sword high, her figure standing proudly in the rain. The officers of the White Lion Legion looked at her and raised their longswords at the same time. Amidst the mist, the snow-white blade suddenly turned into a forest that shone with a cold light. The square formation began to move. Everyone's footsteps became faster and bigger. In the end, it was almost as if they were running wildly. From time to time there would be people who took the lead, but they would be overtaken by the left and right. The row of White Lion Legion soldiers who ran at the front had their silver-gray armor connected to each other. From afar it looked like a line that shone brightly in the rain. This line was constantly changing, and it was moving forward amidst the changes. The White Lion Legion finally burst into a terrifying speed, and the characteristics of this lion were completely displayed in front of everyone on the battlefield. The other commander of Madara's two undead swordsman legions, Mogkin, looked at the scene in front of him in shock. It was as if he saw a silver-gray flood pouring down from the edge of the forest. At that moment he thought of the scene when the white-winged cavalry charged, but that scene was far less shocking than what he saw in the rain today. What kind of infantry were these? There was a flash of fire, and a fireball exploded not far away. The flying mud almost splashed on Mogkin, but he did not seem to notice it at all. The undead were the best army in the world. After the explosion and the flames subsided, the spider swordsmen at the front line were still holding their long swords, coldly guarding their original positions. The scattered formation was no longer in a line, as if they were scattered on the battlefield. The crisscrossing flames began to sweep over their heads, and behind them, an explosion of fire intertwined. Behind them, Serviskag was shouting at the top of his lungs to let the reserves go up. However, it was not that his orders were not firm enough, nor was it that the undead lacked courage. The spider swordsmen stepped forward one after another, fearlessly rushing into the destructive flames. The fireballs landed on their bodies and behind them, and then exploded, blowing these skeletons into pieces. The high temperature even melted their armor, and the flowing metal flowed into the ground, cooling in the rain, forming black metal pancakes. Only a few lucky spider swordsmen could break through the fire net and enter the front line. Erwin's wizards cunningly concentrated their firepower and repeatedly hammered the area in the center of the battlefield, allowing Madara's two wings to be strengthened gradually. However, there was always a weak point in the center of the battlefield. In the end, Serviskag looked at the scene with his mouth wide open in despair. He had never fought a war like this before, and at this moment, he was as helpless as a weak little girl. He knew what the Erwin's people wanted to do, but he did not know how to stop them. Lady Martha, mother of spiders, please save me. The undead did not believe in tears, but Serviskag only wanted to cry. The White Lion Guards finally cut into the front line of Madara's front line like a silver-gray blade. The young people in the front row were less than 10 meters away from the skeleton swordsmen who stood proudly in the drizzle. At this distance, they could even see the flashing white phosphorescent flames in the eyes of the skeleton swordsmen. They were cold as iron, and lacked the emotions of the living. The White Lion Guards were brave, but they were still nervous when facing such an opponent. The sergeants were shouting orders to encourage everyone's courage. Yuta, Vern, Mars and Kargleis, who had caught up from behind, more or less reduced the hesitation in the hearts of the soldiers. The flag of the White Lion Guards advanced in the rain. Under the flag there was another lady who led the charge. She was wearing a white robe with chainmail and holding a cross in her hand. She was dressed in the attire of a battle priest. That was the Hipamera. The others did not understand why the Lord wanted his personal maid to charge with the army, but the female priest had already raised the cross in her hand. Brando followed behind the troops and looked at the scene from afar. Suddenly his heart skipped a beat. He felt that the elemental foundation hanging in the world of planeswalkers was shaken. Light and earth elements rose from the elemental pool, and then disappeared into thin air. He looked up and saw the movements of the skeleton swordsmen of Madara. They clucked and moved. They held the hilts of their swords in their left hands and swung them up forcefully. Hundreds of black swords were swung up neatly from bottom to top. Hundreds of long arcs were drawn in the rain. At a distance of 10 meters, a wave of air that could be seen with the naked eye burst out from the swords. The air blades pushed forward and turned into a cone-shaped shock wave in an instant. It split the curtain of water and brought up a vast expanse of water. With a whoosh, it swept across the first row of sergeants of the White Lion Guards. However, it was at this moment that the bodies of the White Lion Guards flickered with a faint gray light. This light formed an oval sphere under the impact of the shockwave. However, no matter how strong the shockwave was, the sphere did not show any signs of breaking. As the shockwave swept across, almost the entire riverbank was flattened by an inch. The grass on the riverbank was completely blown away, leaving only a patch of pitch-black mud. However, the human soldiers who remained on the mud were completely unharmed. The holy song of protection. Hipamera demonstrated the power of a planeswalker for the first time on the battlefield in the drizzling rain. Everyone who was watching the battle was shocked. What is that? Serviskag almost screamed from his hollow chest. What kind of spell could make an entire army immune to damage? In its empty mind it could not figure out what level of power this was. Even a sage would not be able to master such a law. Only a god, and only those who were above the rules of the mortal world, could perform such a miracle. Mogjan's mind was also blank. He was a lich, so he could understand the horror of the previous scene. It was not a spell but a power that was above the spell. At that moment, it keenly sensed a certain law of existence shuddering through the clouds. Even though he was an undead, he still felt depressed at that moment. How many years had it been since he tasted such horror? It seemed that ever since he became a lich, He had long forgotten the feelings that originally belonged to a living creature. After a moment of shock, the unscathed White Lion Guards and the Spider Swordsmen intertwined. Both sides were third-grade armies, but even if the young White Lion Guards were still in the stage of combining the old with the new, and even if the Tonagels' formation was far less orderly than the Undead's, and even if this new army still had many weak points, they only had one advantage. The terrifying group of mages finally showed its effect at this moment. In the Amber Sword, most of the buff spells that were suitable for an entire army were generally weaker, such as bravery or morale. As for the real buff spells such as Wings of the Wind, Air Shield, Heaven's Blade, Stone Skin, and Dragon's Power, they could only buff a few people at a time. These spells were more suitable for small team battles. If a few wizards or mages had to buff the whole army, they would probably die of exhaustion even if they had sufficient magic power. Even if they did not die of exhaustion, how could there be so much time to waste on the battlefield? But this problem was not a problem for the White Lion Guards. The entire White Lion army was only 1,500 people, but the size of their group of mages was 120 people. Brando divided the entire army into 100 sections in advance, and each wizard only needed to be in charge of the section that they had received orders in advance. In just a few spells, these powerful buff spells would fall on everyone's head. This was not his own invention. After the Battle of the Oblique Forest, since the wizards began to participate in large-scale battles, the smart players began to summarize and create these standardized tactical forms. Every minute detail was the experience of the predecessors who had experienced several battles, but this one was particularly special. This was because it came from Madara itself. This was the real magic army that rose in the future Slate War. Although the White Lion army was far from the level of the future, it was already above this era. In another part of history, the undead of Madara had used this set of tactics to defeat the Erewhon people, defeated the Wind Elves, and defeated the Cruz people. But today they were going to taste the fruits of their own labor. I wonder if this student of mine is good at learning, Brando thought in his heart. He calmly watched the White Lion Guards cut into the Viscag army's front line. Although the undead were tough, their fragile front line could not stop the White Lion Guards who had already charged in. The silver flood rushed into the black front line, and in the blink of an eye, they had broken through the dam and rushed to the rear of the Madara army. Before the black roses could bloom, they withered in the drizzle. The Spider Swordsmen, who were obviously at a disadvantage in terms of numbers, were drowned by the White Lion Guards one by one. Under the cover of Sujin's barrage, the Tonagel army had a partial advantage on the battlefield. Even with the support of a full set of spells, the individual strength of the human soldiers had far surpassed that of the undead swordsmen. Many of the skeleton swordsmen's greatswords were broken under the astonishing strength of the White Lion Guards. Then they were separated and fought for their own. Under such circumstances, the undead of Madara could not effectively protect the liches in the army. Often the liches were killed one by one, and the skeletons fell in droves. Although the undead army was not afraid of death, they had a fatal weakness. Its low-level undead, including the Spider Swordsman and the Skeleton Knight, were all supported by the power of the soul. They were not high-level undead with real souls. The source of power of these undead came from the liches themselves. Once the liches that summoned them died, they would exhaust their soul fire and turn into ashes in a short period of time. At this moment the White Lion Guards were accomplishing such a thing. The front line of the undead of Madara had been torn apart, and the liches that commanded from behind were also exposed to the sword. The unfinished business of Mr. Planchet Knight was now completed by Freya. As for Freya at this moment, she had her eyes on Sir Viscag and the group of black knights around him. After the battle in the deadly tundra, her Valkyrie blood had completely awakened. When the Valkyrie mark was activated, she had at least the combat strength of an intermediate gold. In this era, she was almost the same as the maturing Valkyrie in history. After the Year of the Swift, she met Veronica for the first time and obtained the opportunity to activate her elemental element. A year later, she officially crossed the elemental gate and became the true Valkyrie of Erewhon. The female knight turned her horse around and charged in that direction. On the other side, Mogjin noticed this and wanted to help, but soon the lich stopped because a stone scepter suddenly came from the side. He subconsciously weaved a black magic to block the sudden attack, but a miraculous scene immediately happened. Mogjin watched as the scepter hit his magic barrier. The black light shield squeaked as if it was dying. The lines of law, magic circles, and cipher texts on it began to flash crazily, and then shattered one by one. The light shield was shattered in an instant, and then the stone scepter hit his head. Without any time to react, Mogjin's head shattered like glass and exploded into powder. What kind of damned power is this? The lich screamed from the depths of his soul. His body shook on the skeletal warhorse and fell to the ground. Hippamera stopped and put down the scepter in her hand. She looked up and saw the lich's soul shot into the sky and returned to the phylactery that was hidden somewhere. She was amazed by the power of the scepter in her hand. This was the power that came from the earth and the mountains. A shrill scream pierced through the clouds. Brando looked up instinctively and saw creatures with wings spread out from the dark clouds. The Dreadwraiths were here. They swooped down from the sky, and their ear-piercing screams echoed through the valley. The wails that seeped into people's hearts seemed to be able to send chills down their spines. Unfortunately, it was useless against the White Lion Guards. The courage of the White Lion Guards had always been the most dazzling legend in Erewhon's poems. The White Lion Guards were born immune to fear, and could be said to be the best army against the undead. There were many armies in history that were like archenemies of the White Lion Guards. Erewhon and today's Madara were exactly like that. The Dreadwraith pierced through the rain and headed straight for the Trenthium's magicians. Hundreds of Dreadwraiths swooped down at the same time, creating a frightening deterrent force. Some of the young magicians were so frightened that they hurriedly released a few fireballs into the air, but the flying undead creatures easily dodged them with their nimble falling leaves maneuver. The magicians wanted to continue casting spells, but before they could finish their incantations, they were hit hard on the head. They turned around and saw Lord Mordenkainen and his duck familiar glaring at them sternly. Don't get the wrong target. Mordenkainen was no longer the unlucky apprentice he used to be. After the battle in the Loop of Trade Winds, he grew rapidly and was now close to the strength of a gold. He was one of the few wizards in the Shire who had this level of strength and was now the captain of the Mage Legion. Scenes like this were happening everywhere in the Mage Legion. However, in the eyes of the outsiders, the Magi had changed their target after a few fireballs. They continued to focus on bombarding the skeleton swordsmen on the riverbank. They're crazy. The Bloodstaff was gradually reducing the forces in the front, and the pressure on the Viro people was greatly reduced. However, when they came back to their senses and saw this scene, they were almost scared out of their wits. Count Tonagel doesn't want the Mage Legion anymore? Count Jacques had the same confusion in his heart, but he believed that the Count was not that stupid. He must have a backup plan. But where was the backup plan? His gaze fell on the silent Black Forest. The Bloodstaff also looked at the Black Forest. In fact, at this time, both sides of the battlefield more or less had some kind of premonition in their hearts. It was like a spark in the spirit that suddenly bloomed, giving people the ability to predict the future. Sure enough, in an instant, the forest threw an arrow high up into the air. The battlefield seemed to have come to a standstill. Everyone saw the arrow fly up slowly, drawing an ugly parabola. It did not hit any of the Auroras, but it flew halfway before it ran out of energy and fell on Brendel's shoulder. Brando glanced at the arrow, then looked back at the dark linden forest behind him in confusion. Sorry, my hand slipped. Finny stuck out her tongue. The tree elf archer looked at her commander in embarrassment. It's all because of the monster's cries. They scared me. Medisha looked at her, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. She shook her head, then turned around and raised the wind archer longbow in her hand. But this crooked arrow was like a signal on the battlefield. The next moment, a sharp whistle rang through the sky. In front of everyone's eyes, a wall rose up from the forest. It was a dark green wall. This wall was made up of countless green dots, and each green was a shining arrow. They're planning to use archers to deal with the feared spirits? The Bloodstaff heaved a sigh of relief when it saw this. The Viro people had once used crossbowmen to fight against its Dreadwraiths, but after 2 volleys of crossbowmen with thousands of elite crossbowmen, only 2 of the Dreadwraiths were slightly injured. The Dreadwraiths were too fast and flew too high. They also had arrow resistance like the skeletons, so they were not afraid of the soft attacks. Needless to say, in this weather, the archers were more affected than the crossbowmen. The scornful sneer on its skull did not have time to expand further before it froze on its face. That was because it saw that the arrows did not fly in a parabolic trajectory like the arrows shot by ordinary archers, flying high into the air, passing through the feared wraiths before falling. Instead, the green wall was like a hurricane that swept through the formation of the flying feared wraiths. It flew for 3 to 4 miles before it gradually ran out of momentum and began to fall from the highest point. But all this was not important. What was important was that after the rain of arrows, more than 20 of the feared spirits fell like rain. Elven archers. The bloodstaff felt a buzzing in its head at this range. Only the best archers among the elves could have such a terrifying range. But neither the wind elves nor the wild elves could appear in this place. The bloodstaff's throat gurgled as it stared at the troop. For a moment it only wanted to understand one thing. Where did this troop come from? At the same time, Count Jacques was also shocked. Enchanted arrows. He looked at the scene in a daze and suddenly understood where his mistake was. Chapter 873. The Wind Archer was a Tier 4 troop type, and so was the Dreadwraith. However, the nimbleness and mobility that the Dreadwraith prided itself on was naturally countered by the Wind Archer, which pursued precision. The arrow immunity that their terrifying skeleton-like bodies provided was not even worth mentioning in front of enchanted arrows. All that was left was a pitiful amount of defense and HP. The undead creatures flapped their tattered wings and flew over the battlefield. Their shrill cries were heard as they flew over the White Lion guards. When Carglass looked up, he saw more of the Dreadwraith's hedgehog-like bodies falling from the sky like rain. After the first wave of arrows, the number of Dreadwraith flying in the air had been reduced by 1/6. The Bloodstaff did not order the Dreadwraith to retreat. The remaining Dreadwraith tumbled in the air and began to dive towards Erwin's group of magicians. "My lord, you know them too well. They're trying to get rid of our magicians." Medisha pursed her lips and looked at the Dreadwraith through the gaps between the trees. Her eyes were full of admiration. Raindrops fell on her soft cheeks and gathered on her sharp chin. In the linden forest near her, about 600 elven and human archers were holding their breaths and hiding under their wide cloaks. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were fixed on the scene. Their hands did not stop moving as they drew a second arrow from the quiver on their backs. Arrow number 3. Medisha drew her bow and aimed at a certain area. Balls of white flames immediately rose from the forest. They were like stars in the darkness. Medisha nodded with satisfaction. "Wait until we're within 400 feet of the Dreadwraith. Listen to my command." She squinted her eyes and calculated the distance. The Dreadwraith was almost above the magicians. Some of the young apprentices screamed in fear. If it were not for the fact that each formation had a leader to maintain order, they would have fled in all directions. At this moment, the Silver Elf Princess opened her mouth slightly. "Follow my lead and shoot." She breathed in the cool air of the forest. Although her archery skills were not top-notch, she was still one of the best among the tree elves as she was once the commander of the Lingu army. As she gave the order, she released the bowstring with her fingertips. The arrow flew out with a splash like a silver thread and drilled into the formation of the Dreadwraith in the sky. It hit the head of one of the Dreadwraith. The Dreadwraith let out a shrill scream. The spot where the arrow pierced through its head instantly lit up with a holy flame. It flailed in the air, but a moment later, its entire body turned into a ball of fire in the air. The ball of fire struggled to fall to the ground, but before it could touch the ground it was burned out. Then, like a storm with the sound of the bowstring, balls of white flames rose from the forest and shot densely at the Dreadwraith that was diving down. For Madara's side, the scene in front of them was a disaster. Almost 100 Dreadwraiths seemed to have collided head-on with the holy storm. They were shot one by one in the storm and then burned up. Wrapped in the holy flame, they howled and fell. Before they could touch the ground, they had already scattered into sparks and ashes. The Dreadwraith maintained their formation and weaved through the sky full of sparks. However, after the storm, they were scattered, and less than a quarter of their original number was left. Beside the Bloodstaff, the high-level liches who summoned the Dreadwraith were almost stunned. They watched as more than half of the high-level undead that they summoned with great difficulty disappeared in the blink of an eye. For a moment, they almost didn't understand what was going on. However, the Bloodstaff understood what was going on. Its skeletal hand clutched its staff, and the soul fire in its eye sockets flickered more violently than ever. It understood that it was fooled by those damn Erwin people. They really did prepare arrows that were baptized with holy water. Count Jacques looked at the scene from afar and couldn't help but sigh. The others were too well prepared. Compared to them, they were like amateurs. Of course, in Brando's eyes, they were only amateurs. But what really surprised him was that the Tanajal people used a different kind of enchantment in the first wave of arrows. If they had used the holy enchantment at the beginning, the Bloodstaff might have let the Dreadwraith retreat. The Tanajal people obviously thought of this and set a trap for Madara's skeletons from the beginning. If they didn't use the enchantment in the first wave of arrows, there would be too many Dreadwraith left. This means that they had already guessed that the Bloodstaff would use the Dreadwraith and how it would use the Dreadwraith. The Tanajal people had even arranged the fate of these Dreadwraith. Count Jacques couldn't help but wonder, how did the Count guess all this? But if he told Brando his doubts, Brando would definitely tell him that he was overthinking things. The Bloodstaff was like a big open book to him, and the contents were written clearly in it. It was like cheating. In history, the Bloodstaff was cautious and courageous, and was good at seizing fleeting opportunities. But when it faced the Erewhon people, it was very arrogant and conceited. With its personality, it would definitely take advantage of Benjamin's mistake in judgment. But if Benjamin didn't show enough sincerity in the first wave of the ambush, it would definitely alert the cautious fellow. So he used the Wind Archer and another enchantment, but he didn't use the Holy Enchantment, which was the most destructive against the undead. He wanted the Bloodstaff to think that this was the ambush of the Erewhon people, and that it was nothing more than this. Then, he would be able to use the Dreadwraith without any worries. As for the matter of how much damage the Dreadwraith had to be dealt, that was pure nonsense. The battlefield was ever-changing, and the human heart was unpredictable. No one could be sure that it would work. Benjamin set up this trap according to the Bloodstaff's personality, with the intention of killing as many Dreadwraith as he could. But now it seemed that the results were beyond his expectations. No, it should be said that it couldn't get any better. There were more than 10 Dreadwraith left in the sky, and even if they swooped down, they wouldn't be able to do anything. After all, the wizards on the ground had the ability to fight back. So, the high-ranked lich who controlled them quickly summoned the remaining seeds back. Otherwise, the undead wouldn't even be able to scout in the sky for the rest of the battle. If there was still a battle to come. The young female archers in the forest looked at the results of their battle in disbelief and almost jumped for joy. Medisha stared at the Dreadwraith that flew back and let out a long sigh. She put down her longbow in the rain, thinking that the Wind Archer's first battle had finally delivered a perfect result. My lord's Wind Archers are far from our era, but they have some unique points, she thought to herself. The Linga Legion in history was a legion that could be used in both long-range and short-range battles. In close-range battles, they rode on unicorns and held silver spears in their hands, and immediately launched a glorious charge. In long-range battles, they took out their longbows and immediately became first-class archers, and were proficient in both foot and mounted archery. The archers that she led in front of her were certainly not as good as her subordinates in history, but they were still first-class in this era, and had to be first-class. Although she usually did not talk much and seemed to be aloof from worldly affairs, she still had the pride of a silver folk in her heart. This was her army, so it could only be the best. Historically, it was called the Linga Legion, and now it should inherit this name. The ancient song that had been passed down in the forest for thousands of years echoed among the trees, singing the legends of the elven heroes who defended against the enemy with their sharp arrows. This was the song of the forest. She looked at Brando standing in the rain outside the border of the forest and was full of admiration. Brando had equipped the Wind Archers with 3 types of enchanted arrows. The first arrow was enchanted with wind wings, which could increase the distance of the arrow. The second arrow was enchanted with rock edge, which was used to deal with heavy cavalry. The third arrow was specially prepared to deal with the war in Madara. Under normal circumstances, each Wind Archer would carry 24 ordinary arrows, and 2 of the 3 types of enchanted arrows, for a total of 30 arrows. However, the main enemy in this battle was the undead, so the number of arrows number 1 and 2 arrows number 2 were specially reduced, and they were replaced with 4 arrows number 3. These 6 enchanted arrows cost a total of 420 tor. With 600 Wind Archers firing 6 volleys at the same time, the maintenance cost of an ordinary infantry regiment for a year would be spent. In the eyes of any noble in Aween, Such an extravagant arrangement was definitely a wastrel. They would rather lose in a battle and spend some money to redeem their freedom. It was probably more worth it than such an extravagant war. How was this a war? It was more like a competition to burn money. However, this expensive expenditure had brought about the proper meaning today. The people of Vero, who were trembling in the forest of linden trees, must have a deeper understanding of this point in their hearts. But how did the Lord see the arrival of this day? The little princess's eyes were filled with confusion and curiosity. She had studied the history of mankind when she was free in Abes. In the past 10 centuries, such an era had never come. The War of the Holy Saints was like a distant memory. What did her Lord see that made him walk further and further on this path? Or was it like what Yuta and the rest said, that the undead in Buchi had left a deep impression on him, and that was why he was able to achieve what he had today? She shook her head again. She had a faint feeling that the Lord had been preparing for something all this time, and it was definitely not just because of what happened in Buchi. Otherwise, his actions in Ampere Seal would not be justified. Medisha turned around and put her index finger and thumb in her mouth. She whistled at her subordinates and her sisters. "Rest is over," she ordered. Her voice was not loud, but it was heard throughout the forest. "We have a good start, but now it is time for us to shine. Let's show our enemies what Lin Gu is like." "Sharp arrows," the girls replied in unison. Medisha nodded. Brando stood on the high ground on the riverbank and looked at the changes in the situation in the hilly area. The White Lion Guards had completely torn apart the positions of the 2 undead swordsmen under the continuous protection of the mages. The light of the fireballs plowed through the entire riverbank, and just as the skeleton swordsmen were about to get up from the ground, sharp icicles came crashing down from the sky. The young White Lion Guards then trampled over the enemies who were barely breathing. Freya and Rabin worked together to kill Viscag. A flag with a black rose and a spider on the battlefield swayed and fell down. Brando pursed his lips and looked coldly at the scene of Viscag fighting with Freya. One of his hands was chopped off, and one of his legs was barely able to maintain balance on the warhorse. He was secretly shocked. If there were humans fighting under such conditions, they would have gone crazy and fought with their last bit of faith. However, Viscag was still relatively calm. This was the undead. There was no fear, fanaticism, or impulse in their empty chest. They were still terrifying poisonous snakes at the last moment of their death, and could bite a hole in your body with their poisonous fangs at any time. Fortunately, they had underestimated their enemy. Viscag fell, following in the footsteps of Mogjan. The former died too aggrieved. Under the buff of the mountain's will, Hippamra displayed a terrifying strength that even he could not imagine. After the battle in the deadly frost forest, Hippamra was already a priest with elemental awakening. Now, she had the same level and combat experience as a warrior, which was basically equivalent to a double elite class in the game. Brando had only heard of this from a few important storyline NPCs. For example, the Sage of the Earth in the north, Eloranta, was one of them. Now there was a ready-made legend in front of him. What was even more terrifying was that Brando now finally understood what the description of the mountain's will meant. She can integrate the blessings from the earth into her fighting style. The more blessings she receives, the higher the attack power and attributes of the scepter. It turned out that this scepter had a chance to add buff spells to the wielder when attacking, and these spells would in turn strengthen the attributes of the mountain's will. It was a classic example of getting stronger as the battle went on. Moreover, Gaia's buff spells were very different from that of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Most of the spells of the Holy Cathedral of Fire targeted the user, so the Holy Cathedral of Fire had the world's strongest battle priest and knight of flame. However, Gaia's buff spells were the opposite. It had the world's strongest buff spells. Brando now saw the White Lion infantry surrounding Hippamra. Each of them was almost as strong as a mini-boss. The White Lion Guards had only been formed for a short time, and now the officers in the army were only at the silver level. There were also many soldiers who were still at the peak of the iron level after taking the dragon's blood potion. However, at this moment, under Hippamra's blessing aura, each of them faintly had the combat power of the peak of the silver level. Brando himself felt that this was a little too ridiculous. Therefore, the left wing where Hippamra was at was advancing very quickly. They had almost killed their way through the front line of the 2 undead swordsmen. According to the original plan, They did not stop to surround the remaining forces of Viskag and Mogjan with their allies. Instead, they continued to attack the Bloodstaff's main camp. The distance between the two sides was not far, and the White Lion infantry was astonishingly fast. At this moment, the Bloodstaff was redeploying the few regiments that were previously used to besiege Viro's people. The rear formation was extremely weak. Once it was broken, the necromancer's phalanx in the center of the formation would be destroyed. Brando looked a little further away. On the other side of the river, the undead were indeed retracting the skeletal cavalry. However, the Lantern Islands and the Highland Knights' cavalry that they were entangled with earlier were now entangled with them. The two light cavalry were locked in a fierce battle in the direction of the valley. It was obvious that the Bloodstaff could not count on their skeletal cavalry for a while. Of course, Brando also could not count on the Lantern Islands to help him attack the flanks of the Bloodstaff. At this point in the battle, in fact, both sides of the battlefield had already grasped the opponent's weakest point. On Erwin's side, the Viro people were still trapped in the Linden Forest. Although they still maintained their morale, they still did not dare to act rashly in the face of the only remaining regiment of skeletal warriors. Their biggest problem was that their only complete second-grade elite crossbowmen were almost useless in this battle. The Lantern Islands had no choice but to help Brando entangle the skeletal cavalry of the Bloodstaff, which was equivalent to nothing. The main battlefield was almost a game between Brando and the Bloodstaff's army. Now, the only advantage for Brando was that the Bloodstaff's army had their backs to him, and the two elite regiments that covered their flanks had already been breached. As long as Tanajal's army could deal a fatal blow to the enemy before the Bloodstaff could completely adjust their formation, then they could win the battle. On the other hand, although the Bloodstaff's army was attacked from the back, they had the advantage in terms of numbers. Behind them were only Brando's 5 regiments of White Lion infantry, 2 regiments of Wind Archers, and 1 mage regiment. The Wind Archers could not be used for a frontal assault, and the 5 regiments of White Lion Guards would not be able to stop after breaking through Viskag's position. Of course, even if there were 1 or 2 regiments of White Lion Guards, they would not be able to do much in the face of Madara's superior numbers. At this moment, both sides of the battle could barely free themselves to adjust their flanks. The Tanajal people desperately wanted to break through the undead's defense line and destroy the Bloodstaff's necromancer's phalanx, while the Bloodstaff desperately wanted to readjust their formation to deal with the army that suddenly appeared. Both sides were in a race against time, or rather, as long as either side had a reserve, then they could defeat the enemy in one fell swoop. But the problem was that both sides seemed to have no reserve. The battle had completely fallen into a tangled stalemate. But this stalemate was something that the Bloodstaff was happy to see. "You're courting death." It let out a sharp laugh. What it needed was time, and not to defeat the enemy as soon as possible. Although it was embarrassing to be tied down by these weak opponents, it was better than losing. Moreover, these humans were the kingdom's last military force in the south. Once they were destroyed, not to mention Viro and Karsuk, even the entire south of Ampere Seal, Madara would have a chance to get their hands on it. They had another ally, Count Randner, who ruled this vast area as a buffer zone between Madara and northern Erewhon. It was obviously something that the Supreme wanted to see. The Bloodstaff finally breathed a sigh of relief, as if it could see victory waving at it. On the hill, in the Linden Forest, Count Jacques' face was also gloomy. The Tanajal people were making a mistake. But perhaps it should not be called a mistake because it was unavoidable. Count Zeline had previously asked him if he should blow the horn to warn Count Tanajal, but he refused because he knew that it would be meaningless. Count Tanajal's choice was actually the right one, but it was still a mistake. The so-called opportunity did not appear on the battlefield. There were still too few troops. He regretted it. If he did not destroy the Viro army, the situation would be different now. The Count subconsciously gripped the hilt of his sword, and his knuckles turned white from nervousness. It was as if he had never held his breath like this when he first went to the battlefield. But no one on the battlefield knew what Brendel's mood was at that moment. He was actually a little relaxed as he stood in the drizzle, because he saw that the Bloodstaff was making a mistake, just as he had imagined it to be. This mistake was fatal, because it actually believed that Tanajal no longer had any reserves to attack its flank. He turned his head, and in the forest, Medisha nodded at him from afar. Then the Silver Elf Princess untied the horn from her waist. It was the dragon horn trombone of the Fran Knight. The pitch-black horn had silver rose patterns on it, and the horn depicted scenes of past wars, recounting a legend. In that legend, it described the sky-blue flags of the plains of Malald fluttering like the sea, described the cold gleam of the Fran lances, described the long sound of the horn, and described the courage of the ancient spirits. It described the scene of the Silver King leading his knight in a charge against the Myrnas. The Silver Elf Princess put the horn to her mouth and blew it hard. The long sound of the horn resounded through the mountains. In everyone's eyes, it was as if snow had fallen. Thousands of silver horses rolled over from the horizon. At that moment the earth rumbled, as if the mountains were resonating. The staff in the Bloodstaff's hand fell to the ground with a clatter. Oh! Chapter 874. A silver line appeared on the horizon. This silver line spread across the hills and valleys. Thunder rumbled as it approached them in the blink of an eye. Only then could they see that it was countless silver horses. These slender, curvaceous Fran horses came to the border of the forest before they began to slow down and slowly came to a stop. They shook their ears and wandered in the meadow outside the forest. The tallest of the horses raised its head and looked in the direction of the forest. The Wind Sagittarius girls who witnessed this scene were all stunned. They all looked at Medisha curiously, their hearts filled with admiration for this princess commander. Medisha blushed slightly, but she quickly calmed down. She ordered calmly, "Linga guards, listen to my command. Get on the horses." When the girls heard the order, they quickly put their longbows on their backs and walked out of the forest one by one. They carefully came to the side of the unusually beautiful warhorses. However, they soon found that these warhorses were unusually friendly to them. Not only did they not have the slightest hostility, they even lowered their heads to be close to them. It was as if this was not the first time they met, but rather the first time they met. The girls were surprised and curious. They pulled down the hood of their cloaks and affectionately touched the mane of their mounts. Then they grabbed the saddle and stepped on the stirrups. One by one they got on the horses. Their movements were very practiced, as if they had been trained for a long time. The last one to get on the horse was Fanny. The chief tree elf archer looked timid at first, but when she got on the horse, she immediately became high-spirited and said happily, "So the Lord made us train every day for today." Brando grabbed the reins and glanced back at her. "I wonder who was the one complaining during the training." Fanny replied without blushing or skipping a beat. "Didn't I just ride it? This horse is so tame. I've never seen such a good horse before. It's as if my heart and soul are connected when I ride it." The other girls also expressed their agreement. Brando knew that the effect description of the Fran Knight's cavalry equip card was pay X wealth. The Fran Knight will turn X followers into cavalry. If they are already cavalry, they will gain the ability to fly. The literal meaning was to transform infantrymen into cavalrymen, and not just summon warhorses. That was why the wind archers felt this way. However, for a person who had never ridden a horse before, even if they suddenly obtained the horsemanship skill, they would still be shocked when they first sat on a horse. Therefore, basic horsemanship training was still necessary. Even if it wasn't effective in a short period of time, at least they had to familiarize themselves with the feeling of riding a horse. It was all for this moment. In the woods of linden trees, mounted archers? Count Zlin asked in disbelief. Count Jacques shook his head slightly. Count Zlin was obviously the kind of guy who didn't know anything about military affairs, but liked to listen to rumors. The bows on their backs are more than 1.5 meters long, which is a typical infantry longbow. They can't be used on horseback. Unless they have other short bows, they can't be mounted archers. Maybe they even have short bows. Otherwise, why would they summon these horses? It's also possible. Count Jacques replied after thinking for a while. He didn't know what the Tanagal people were thinking. However, the fact that the Count could summon a cavalry unit reignited his hope. He rubbed the hilt of his sword and began to think about when to cooperate with the Tanagal people to attack and turn the situation around. In Madara's camp, the Bloodstaff came to the same conclusion. Erwin's men suddenly had a cavalry unit that could threaten its flank, which made it feel a little uneasy. The army on the other side was too strange. It was thinking about what the enemy commander wanted to do with the mounted archers, but it couldn't figure it out. The other Dark Lords also felt that it was inconceivable. In the end, they came to the same conclusion. The mounted archers were very likely to be a distraction for Erwin's men to distract them. If they really split up, the center of the camp would not be able to withstand the attack of the 5 regiments of the White Lion infantry. But it didn't seem like a good idea to let the mounted archers wander around. In the end, the Bloodstaff ordered the last remaining skeleton warrior unit to go up and attack. At least, they wouldn't be able to harass its flank. Seeing that the Bloodstaff was still acting according to the rules, Brando couldn't help but smile. "Now it's up to you, Medisha. My lord, the outcome has been decided. This time please lead us personally." The Silver Elf Princess replied softly. Brando nodded. "Call the Nightsong Tiger and the others out." Medisa whistled like a nightingale, and a few moments later, more than 10 mounted knights came out from the forest. They were the Nightsong Tiger and his men, but their attire was completely different from the last time they were here. The Nightsong Tiger was wearing a set of exquisite and heavy armor. It was in the style of the White City. The armor was connected to the arm guard, and there were patterns of sea monsters on it. He wielded a long spear, and a sheathed long sword and battle axe were hanging from his waist. He looked more like a knight than a mercenary. But Brando knew that this was the armor of the elite knight of the Faraway Eagles, the most famous mercenary group in the White City. The others were dressed similarly, except for Falerne and her sister. The Wild Elf Princess was wearing a gray leather robe with countless ribbons on her back. Each ribbon had a brass ring attached to it. This strange robe was a sorcerer's robe, and each brass ring was engraved with a corresponding spell that could be used in battle. It was the standard attire of a combat wizard. On the other hand, the younger sister of the Wild Elves, Tia, was wearing a loose white robe and a pointy wizard hat. She had already become an official elven envoy. At this moment, she was looking at her lord with a smile on her face. The Nightsong Tiger greeted Brando with a smile. "My lord, long time no see. We've been training for so long, and we've been bored to death. The Shire of Rhodes is prosperous and beautiful in the evening, but it can't compare to the real world. Besides, we're looking forward to a life of fighting." "When did you become so polite, Nightsong Tiger?" Brando was a little apologetic. "I won't be like this in the future." "Really?" Tia asked happily. "Of course. In fact, the White City Vanguard only costs 5 wind and 20 Medisa MP per day." Brendel nodded, but Falerne snorted softly and looked over in surprise. The Wild Elf turned her face away, and only her pointed ears were visible to him. "She's really angry." Brando thought to himself. Card creatures all had emotions, and he wondered how Mephistopheles and Andrique were doing. The former was fine, but the latter probably wanted to kill him. He looked at the riverbank and saw that the battle was progressing very slowly. Madara's army was like a giant turntable that was slowly turning in the rain. Freya was commanding the White Lion Guards to break through the Spider Swordsman's broken defense line. But the undead were different from humans. Even in such a situation, they still caused a lot of trouble for Freya. Brando tightened his grip on his horse and rode it to the front of Lin Ji's guards. He turned his horse around and faced the direction of Madara's army. "Go around the White Lion Guards and follow me." The army began to move. Close to 1,000 silver warhorses and the archer girls on their backs slowly circled around the White Lion Squad's frontal assault and circled around the flanks of the Bloodstaff's army. The Viro people and Madara's undead were watching this scene closely. Even though they knew that these were not terrifying mounted archers, allowing such an army to directly threaten their empty flanks made the Bloodstaff feel slightly uneasy. "Let our archers keep an eye on that side," the Bloodstaff said to the Lich beside him. "Don't let Erwin's people go too far. Our archers may not be their match," a dark noble said with a hoarse voice. "Of course not. Those are elven archers. Our archers are just decorations in front of them, but if they really have short bows, then they will be at a disadvantage in front of our longbows. Do you understand, idiot?" Brando looked at the Bloodstaff's movements and thought that this old lord of Madara's had a watertight plan. But unfortunately, some things were destined to be beyond his imagination. The Lin Ji's guards moved forward slowly and stopped when they were about 1,000 feet away from the Bloodstaff's army. No one understood what the archers were trying to do at this distance, but they immediately gave the answer with their actions. Under everyone's gaze, The wind archers jumped off their horses in unison as if they had rehearsed this countless times. They ran forward to the open space and got into formation. Then they raised their longbows at the command. Before the bloodstaff could react, the arrows of Erwin's people had already risen into the sky. The undead commanders looked up at the dense dots of light. They paused for a moment after flying to the highest point, then whizzed down. In an instant, it was as if a rain of light had fallen on the flanks of the bloodstaff's position. This was different from Viro's crossbowman's volley. The arrows of the wind archers were faster, more penetrative and more accurate. Moreover, all of them were enchanted with holy attributes. After a round of arrow rain, the bloodstaff's flanks seemed to have been combed by a comb, and several rows of skeleton archers fell. The bloodstaff could not take it anymore. At this distance, its skeleton archers could not shoot at the enemy at all, could only take a beating. It never dreamed that it would be infantry on horseback. At this moment, it only felt that there was a hole in the head of the opposing commander. What was he thinking? Couldn't he just fight a proper battle? However, although it was criticizing in its heart, this Dark Lord who had been famous for a long time had no choice but to order the skeleton warriors to attack and drive away the army of elven archers. Otherwise, it would go crazy if it allowed those archers to shoot at will. When the wind archers under Brando saw the skeleton army attacking, they did not panic and returned to the formation in an orderly manner. They mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving the skeleton army far behind. After they had run for a distance, they stopped their horses under Brando's command and got into formation again to fire at the skeleton army. This time the undead commanders were dumbfounded. What should they do? They could not chase after them. They could not shoot at them. If there were still dreadwraiths, they could let the dreadwraiths entangle the enemy, and then send the skeleton army to chase after them and destroy them in one fell swoop. However, the dreadwraiths were already exhausted. The remaining dozen or so would not be enough for a round of volley. Of course, they still had cavalry. The problem was that if they transferred the cavalry over, it would be equivalent to letting the Lantonians attack their flanks as they pleased. That would only cause them to collapse even faster. Bloodstaff was instantly at a loss. How were they going to fight this battle? If the opponent was just a normal cavalry, it could still rely on the undead's almost unlimited stamina to wear down the opponent's mounts. The problem was that the opponent's warhorses were all summoned. Since when did summoned creatures have limited stamina? Not only did they summon them, but each archer also had 3 warhorses. It did not matter even if 1 or 2 of them died. It was now beginning to understand Viscag's mentality before the battle. He wanted to cry but had no tears. What kind of army was this? The infantry ran faster than the cavalry, but the archers were equipped with 3 warhorses each. This was clearly the arrangement of elite cavalry. What was the enemy commander thinking? Count Jacques could not help but be stunned when he saw this scene from afar. This is Fanzin's dragon cavalry tactic. Equipping each archer with 3 warhorses, this count is really rich. Count Zéline also sighed. Those warhorses were summoned. Count Jacques saw that his colleagues had misunderstood and had to explain. However, he still sighed in his heart. The only person who could use this tactic in Erwin was probably this count. He still did not understand how the other party could summon these handsome warhorses. Who exactly was this Count Tonagel? But now he suddenly understood. Only such a person could single-handedly turn the tide of the battle in Empire-Seal. We have underestimated him, Count Zéline. He could not help but shake his head and sigh. The situation on the battlefield was gradually becoming clearer. The badly battered Bloodstaff had no choice but to send one of his skeleton warriors to stall the enemy's wind archers, or rather, to feed them to the enemy. The only thing he could hope for was that the enemy's elven archers would eat a little slower so that he could free himself to deal with the White Lion infantry on the riverbank. Although the elven archers were disgusting, they were not an army that could decide the outcome of a battle. His plan seemed to be very successful. Brando's wind archers still had 2 holy attribute enchanted arrows. Naturally, they would not waste them on the skeleton army. They could only use ordinary arrows from afar to slowly deplete their vitality. This way the Bloodstaff finally won some time. It finally mobilized 2 regiments of spider swordsmen to its front. Together with the skeleton warriors and 2 skeleton archers, Madara had the absolute strength to suppress Brando's White Lion Guards for the first time. At this time, the White Lion Guards had just finished cleaning up the remaining troops of Viscag and Mojin. With Hippamura and Freya as the spearhead, they directly attacked Madara's main force. The final moment of victory on the battlefield seemed to have appeared at this moment. The two armies were entangled at a single point. Erwin's mages once again unleashed their fireballs across the entire valley and landed on Madara's army. After nearly half an hour of silence, the necromancers and skeleton mages began to counterattack for the first time. Green and golden light beams flew across the sky above the two armies. Soon Erwin's mages began to fall silent. Haha! The dark mercenaries from the Sea of the Dying Moon naturally knew what this meant. They could not help but scream in excitement. Their wizards are out of mana. Confidence seemed to have returned to these dark nobles. For a moment they almost thought that they had lost. Martha above, victory belongs to the Black Rose of the Roman Tua. Some even shouted. It was a pity that the undead army had no morale. Otherwise, their morale would have been greatly boosted. Perhaps they would have directly defeated the White Lion Guards. Compared to the nobles of Madara who were rejoicing, the people of Viro were much more depressed. Count Zelene had asked them to immediately send troops to help Tanajil. He was also the first to ask for a retreat. Now he was also the most enthusiastic. However, Count Jacques had already seen through his nature. He just shook his head coldly. He stared at the battlefield. The time was far from right. He believed that the Count must have a backup plan. The Shire stood in the middle of the mages' formation. Looking at the bright green light of the necromancer's formation in Madara's direction, he could roughly guess what they were thinking. However, he calmly waited for the third round of attacks before he snapped his fingers at his subordinates. You can remove the magic barrier now. In a traditional battle between adepts, the first 3 rounds of attacks were the fiercest and most concentrated. Especially when the opponent realized that they had exhausted all of their magic power, they would definitely double their efforts and try to eliminate them in one fell swoop. All of the mages' guesses were correct except for one thing. After the magic barrier was removed, all of the mages in Tanajil's army did the same thing. They opened the leather pouches on their belts. There were a total of 3 of these pouches. Then they took out a bottle filled with light blue liquid. They frowned, pinched their noses, and raised their heads to drink it. The next moment, the mage's exhausted mental strength surged again. The blood staff was a necromancer. Its vision was protected by the power of the law. Therefore, it could clearly see this scene from a few miles away. Of course, it knew what the mages drank. It was not that it had never seen mana potions before, but it had never seen so many of them. Hundreds of bottles of mana potions disappeared in an instant. The only reason they used them was to defeat the necromancers. Only those who had dealt with magic would understand what this meant. At that moment, the bloodstaff only wanted to cry out loud. If it could, it would have run over to the enemy's commander and punched him in the face. If it had known that it was so valuable, it would have just let the enemy give it all the mana potions, and it would have just raised its hands and surrendered. Chapter 875. In the blink of an eye, the bloodstaff's formation was once again lit up with magic. This time the situation was reversed. The necromancers had used up all their mana, and the battle between the necromancers and Erwin was now a one-sided performance. It was as if history was repeating itself. Under the cover of the barrage of magic, the White Lion Legion once again broke through the undead army's formation. However, this time it was not as easy as before. The undead army's formation was extremely thick, and there were almost 3 to 4 regiments of soldiers gathered in the middle. The White Lion Legion's advance was extremely fast at first, but it soon slowed down. Both sides were once again caught up in the battle. The Bloodstaff constantly mobilized its forces to strengthen the center, preventing the White Lion Legion from breaking through its defenses. At this time, the White Lion Legion's strength was close to that of a Tier 4 army under the buff of various spells. Only a few of their opponents were Tier 3 spider swordsmen. Most of the skeletal warriors were no match for the young White Lion Legion, and could only rely on their numbers to slow them down. At this time, the Bloodstaff's flanks could not be more empty. There was nothing it could do. If it did not strengthen the center, it would be defeated once the White Lion Legion broke through. As for the wind archers at the side, if they wanted to harass it, then let them. However, it did not know that Brando was waiting for this opportunity. Under Brando's command, the wind archers stopped once again, but this time when they raised their longbows, the arrows on the arms of the bows were replaced with shiny sacred silver arrows. The wind archers used their nails to scratch the arrowheads, and holy white flames immediately ignited. After a round of arrows, the skeletal warriors that were chasing after them were scattered. They then used the arrows of the rocky edge archers to cover the area, and no one was left standing. Brando observed the outcome of the battle and nodded. He raised Haurangaya in the drizzle and was the first to step out. The Nightsong Tiger and the 12 White Lion Legion vanguards followed behind him, and the 13 knights got into a charging formation. Medisha! Brando shouted in the drizzle. I understand, my lord. Medisha raised her longbow. Under her command, the wind archers extended their line of fire and aimed at the Bloodstaff's flanks. Brando urged his mount forward with the Nightsong Tiger and Falerne on his left and right, and the other knight behind them. The small cavalry slowly covered a distance of 200 feet, and then began to accelerate. Of course, the Bloodstaff's attention. But because the battle was over 100 of its eyes of the Bloodstaff noticed the presence of the cavalry. Bloodstaff noticed the cavalry of the Bloods of A's. Brando, the Nightsong Tiger, and the others began to jog. At this time, Medisha finally gave the final order. Arrow number 3. She did not announce the direction of the wind. On the battlefield, wind was the most troublesome enemy for most archers. But the wind archers were an exception. The wind was their friend. No matter which direction the wind blew, it would not affect the arrows fired by the wind archers. This was one of the special abilities of the wind archers. They were also one of the few long-range units in the world. The archers silently replaced their arrows with holy silver arrows and activated their enchantments. Another wave of light rained down on the side of the Bloodstaff, and the skeleton archers and skeleton warriors that were originally there suddenly cleared out a large portion of them. It was as though they had opened up a gap for Brendel and the others to charge through. At this time, Brando had entered the final sprint distance. He raised his head and could see the Black Knight's army moving through the Madara army. However, he did not rush to give the order. Instead, he ordered his men to maintain a jog. He was still waiting. The wind archers fired the last volley of arrows. Then they dropped their longbows and ran back to their horses. They grabbed the saddles and flipped over to their horses. They pulled out a shiny scimitar from under their cloaks. In an instant, the wind archers had turned into a cavalry that was ready to go. Medisha also switched to a silver spear. At this moment, she finally felt like she had returned to the era of the War of the Holy Saints. It was as if the invincible Lin Gu Legion was behind her. She leveled her spear in the rain. Her unicorn kicked its hooves anxiously. The silver elf princess took a deep breath and gave the order. Lin Gu Legion, follow me. The army began to move forward. Tanajul wants to use archers as cavalry. Count Zeline almost thought that he was hallucinating. He could not help but pull his hair. Are they crazy? But this time, Count Jacques did not answer his stupid question. He turned around with a cold face and said to everyone, "Get ready. We are ready to attack. The time for the final battle has come." He didn't say much, but a clear idea appeared in his mind. In a legend, he had heard of such an army. That legend was so famous. Even the Bloodstaff realized it. The War of the Holy Saints was such a vivid memory for this world. It was a legend about how the 4 sages defeated the dark forces that ruled the world and built the 4 glorious empires in Wonde. The 4 holy cathedrals had ruled Wonde for nearly 1,000 years. The beautification of the sages had long been deeply ingrained in the hearts of the people under their rule. The undead of Madara were never born out of thin air. Memories were a kind of pain and suffering for them, but they could never get rid of them. The legend that it had heard of at some point in time floated in the Bloodstaff's mind. It saw the elven archers who had thrown down their longbows and mounted their horses, ready to charge. It suddenly realized that it had heard of such an army before. This army had a beautiful name. It was called Lingu. Silver Elves. Count Jacques suddenly remembered some of the rumors about Brando. Some of them were about his relationship with the Silver Elves. He did not think that the Silver Elves would lend him this legendary army. Was it a blessing or a curse for such people to exist in a small country like Erewhon? It was still a mystery. In fact, everyone's guess was a little off. Although the Wind Elf archers had inherited the name of Lingu, which had disappeared for thousands of years, they were not the legendary army in history. The Tree Elf archers and Wind archers had received some close combat training, and it was difficult for them to charge on horseback. But when Medisha gave the order, these archers did not hesitate and showed courage that was not inferior to the men. Brando looked back at this scene and finally nodded with satisfaction. He then turned back to the Nightsong Tiger and said, "Now let us open a gap for the girls." "As you wish, my lord." The Nightsong Tiger replied. "Charge." The 13 knights suddenly accelerated and began their final charge. In front of them was Bloodstaff's flank, where nearly 100 black knights were waiting for them. The black knights under Bloodstaff's command were at least at the upper silver rank, and many of them were at the peak of the silver rank. Moreover, most of them were highly skilled in martial arts and had experienced hundreds of battles. In Bloodstaff's opinion, even facing Erewhon's noble guards would be easy. Under normal circumstances this was indeed the case, but the enemy they were facing this time was not ordinary. Brando took the lead and was the first to charge into the enemy's formation. When the Viro people rushed out of the forest, they saw this scene. Knights leading their attendants to charge had long been the norm in the continent of Vaunt. However, it was rare for a count with real power to lead dozens of personal guards to personally charge into the enemy's ranks, at least after the Cipher dynasty. The Viro nobles thought they were looking at a madman, but they did not expect something even crazier to come. The 13 knights stood side by side, forming a sharp arrow. Brando was at the tip of this arrow. He raised Halrangaya and swung it at a black knight charging at him. The knight quickly raised his sword to block, but the black knight and his skeletal horse's head were cut into 6 pieces. The pieces burned brightly and disappeared into the rain. Another knight behind the black knight watched as his comrade was cut into pieces in front of him. But before he could react, Halrangaya had already pierced through the body of the black knight in front of him. He only had time to let out a hollow scream before the Halrangaya landed heavily on his breastplate. The huge force pulled him off his horse and sent him flying into the distance, landing on the black knight behind him. Only then did the power of the piercing strike explode. With the black knight's body as the center, a fan-shaped shockwave formed behind him. After a loud bang, most of the black knights in that direction fell to the ground. In just 2 moves, Brando had killed nearly a quarter of the black knights. The tight formation of the black knights had now been cleared by Brando. What kind of power was this? The nobles of Viro seemed to have just remembered that this young count was not only powerful, but he was also an outstanding swordsman. There were even rumors that he had reached the level of a sword saint. Although the credibility of this statement was very low, the scene before them at least proved that the count's methods were at least several levels higher than those so-called gold rankers. Could it be that, after the Flame King Gretel, there really was another 20-year-old elemental awakening prodigy? This was the only thought in the minds of the nobles of Viro at the moment. Compared to the Viro people's feelings of surprise and jealousy, the Bloodstaff was the one with unspeakable bitterness at this moment. It finally saw that not only was the young commander an elemental awakened being, but the 12 knights around him were also not to be trifled with. The 12 knights were all existences with strength above the gold rank. Facing such a personal guard of the count, it almost groaned out loud. What kind of army did it encounter? Even if someone were to tell it that this army was Erewhon's royal guards, it would not be able to help but believe it. But what made it very uncomfortable was that this army seemed to have no origin and appeared out of thin air. Tanajal. It repeatedly muttered this most remote place in the southeast of the kingdom of Erewhon. It still could not understand how such a fierce army could emerge from such a place. But it did not hesitate for too long. For its army, it was now the most critical moment. It had to guard the flank and prevent it from being broken through, otherwise all its previous efforts would be in vain. The Bloodstaff hesitated for a moment and decided to personally lead a regiment of skeleton warriors to support the collapsing flank. Since the opponent had already sent out an elemental ranker, it could no longer hold back. On this battlefield, it was the only one who could fight Brando. The Bloodstaff was still mobilizing its troops when Medisha and her wind archers finally collided with Madara's flank. Brando felt his elemental pool fluctuating twice in a row. Then he saw Medisha raising her spear in the army and shouting, "May the Holy Spirit of heaven descend and bless you and me in the war. Those who fight for justice shall uphold the inspiration of justice." A white beam of light seemed to split the haze and descended straight from midair. The beam of light fell into the army of wind archers. Countless angels descended from the white beam of light one by one, guarding behind each wind archer. Under their protection, the strength of the archer girls under Medisha's command soared. Their strength, which was originally only at the mid-silver level, had now soared to the peak of silver level, and even faintly showed signs of stepping into the realm of gold. Inspire Yunga V Light 5 spell. Pay half of the mana Knight. The Farron Knight inspire all allies and upgrade them. Current level +5. Sustain. Inspire will be maintained until the next day's reset. My glory is your glory. At this moment, Brando really saw the horror of the Farron Knight. The Wind Archers, who were originally at the mid-silver level, were at most at the peak of iron in terms of close combat experience and skills, and the archer armor, which pursued flexibility, was far inferior to the skeleton warrior's infantry armor in close combat. Therefore, the combat strength of the rank 4 Wind Archers in close combat was only on par with the rank 2 skeleton warriors. However, after their courage had reached the pinnacle of silver rank, the girls' battle prowess had increased to the lower levels of silver rank. From iron rank to silver rank, this was a qualitative change. Now they could easily crush the skeletons who were one rank below them. This was not the end. Medisha immediately showed the second card. Group Sprint Yunga IV Earth 2. Spell. Pay 1 glory. The Farron Knight inspire his followers to obtain the group ability. Sustain. Group charge will be maintained until the next day's reset. I saw it with my own eyes. The Sabri people screamed and launched their charge. An army of tens of thousands collapsed in front of them. Baron Cardin. Group ability. When creatures with the same ability are within a certain range, they will receive a 1% damage bonus. For every additional creature with this ability, the damage will increase by an additional amount. With the support of this card, the Wind Archers around Medisha suddenly became more aggressive. After their damage was doubled, they stood out from the ordinary knight and instantly became the ready-made personal guards of the general. Once the knight army was formed, the undead's defense line immediately collapsed. Bloodstaff originally thought that his flank could still hold on for a while, but with the support of Medisha's 2 cards, his plan was easily burst like a bubble. When Bloodstaff personally led a regiment of skeletal warriors to the battlefield, he saw his flank melting like snow under the sun. The Wind Archers were still moving forward, seemingly intending to break through his flank and head to the center of the battlefield to meet with the White Lion Guards. When Bloodstaff saw this scene, he knew that it was all over. His army was all done for, and the dark nobles from the Sea of the Dying Moon were also done for. As for the spy in the kingdom of Erewhon, Count Randner, he was not even worth mentioning in the Bloodstaff's mind. He originally came to block Brando's path of attack, but at this moment, he did not even think about it and turned around to run. The only way for him to survive was to gather the remaining skeletal warriors and retreat from the battlefield. At least he had one advantage, and that was that the undead would never feel tired and would not be completely defeated. On the other hand, these humans could not chase after them endlessly. He no longer dared to hope for a false victory. It was already lucky enough to escape back to Madara. Faint cheers of the humans could be heard on the battlefield. Most of these cheers were from the people of Vero. It was a kind of rejoicing after a disaster, especially the soldiers of the lower ranks. They could not believe that the undead army was defeated just like that. Although there were still thousands of skeletons on the battlefield, they could see that Tanajal's army had completely divided the Madara army. Groups of liches were falling under their swords, and victory was only a matter of time. It was not only the soldiers, but the nobles of Vero also gradually stopped. They began to realize that even if they did not charge, the skeletons in front of them were turning into ashes. The undead army was retreating. Count Jacques was certain that Bloodstaff had begun to waver, or else the undead army would not have retreated. They were only stalling for time. The outcome of the battle was already decided, and the only thing left was how much they won. But what made the people of Vero feel a little embarrassed was that the outcome of the battle did not seem to have much to do with them. Under their gazes, Count Tanajal finally stopped in the middle of the chaotic battlefield. The undead army was crumbling around him. Author's note: Today is the weekend. I wish everyone a happy weekend. Chapter 876. After the year of the Running Wolf, the most outstanding military strategist in the history of the Wind Elves, the king of the Grey Mountain Shaglafen, who had not yet been promoted to the position of marshal, wrote in his book, "If we can't effectively kill the liches in the Madara army, then we can't really defeat an undead army." But when the Black Rose of the Roman Tuwa was truly defeated, the defeated skeletons in the valley were actually not much different from a human army fleeing in all directions. The undead fled back all over the mountains and plains, and because they had lost their command, the liches and the skeletons they summoned fought on their own, like a sheet of loose sand. Although the undead lords from the Sea of the Dead Moon could still restrain their subordinates, they only wanted to escape and had lost their will to fight. The current Bloodstaff army could no longer be called an army. From top to bottom they had lost their purpose and will to fight, and only struggled to protect themselves. It was no different from the defeated army of the northern nobles in Ampere Seal. But if one looked carefully, there were some subtle differences. When humans fled in the face of a defeated army, it was often because of the fear in their hearts that shook and gave in to the emotions of the undead. These two factors did not exist in the emotions of the undead. They only protected themselves out of a rational choice. They would not trample on each other because of panic, or be killed like ducks without daring to turn back and resist. If they were caught, they would stop and fight back. But due to the selfish nature of dark creatures, they would never help their comrades who were attacked nearby, even if it might be more beneficial to them. Count Jacques and Brando rode side by side in the valley. Seeing this scene, they were very emotional. So the undead army is just like this. They can also make mistakes. The undead are not natural creatures. No one knows the mystery between life and death better than them. So they eliminate the uneasiness in the hearts of mortals about the unknown death. They have no attachment to life, so they don't feel impulsive and fanatical. However, impulsiveness and fear are only one of all the negative emotions. Greed, arrogance, vanity, and selfishness will all make them make mistakes. Brendel explained to Duke Viro's vassal as he observed the progress of the battle from his horse's back. Count Jacques silently nodded. He looked deeply at this count, who was also a count but was much younger than him. "Mr. Count, you seem to know a lot about the Dark Kingdom? I always try to understand my enemy, the enemy of the kingdom." Brando looked at the count from the Jacquelangan region. He knew this man. Jacquelangan was located on the border between Viro and Karsuk. This count was someone who had dealt with Madara in history. Although he had some of the common faults of the Erewhon nobles of this era, his understanding of the Roman Black Rose was much deeper than the other nobles. It was rare that this man was trusted by the Grand Duke of Viro. "Mr. Maberto," he continued, "I suggest that you don't underestimate the Black Rose just because of what you saw today. Of course, I don't dare to underestimate them anymore. When I was young, I saw my father bringing back bear and wolf prey during winter hunts. I always thought that these beasts in the forest were nothing special. Later on, I was lucky enough to have a cunning guy leave a mark on my body. The scar is still on my back to this day. From then on, I learned that I can never underestimate any of my opponents." Count Jacques made an analogy to let Brando understand that he was talking about what happened today. He meant that he would never forget what happened today. If I don't teach them a lesson, they won't understand what kind of enemy they're facing. Only by making them understand where the real threat lies, under the pressure of external forces, the kingdom will be able to quickly walk down the path I want. That's one of my goals. If I don't teach them a lesson, they won't understand what kind of enemy they're facing." He smiled and shook his head, continuing to expose Madara's past. But what Mr. Maberto is thinking now is that he has grasped the weakness of these skeletons. If that's the case, then you are gravely mistaken. Count Jacques was a little stunned. "Why do you say that? I think what you described is very reasonable. Those skeletons do have that kind of weakness. That is the nature of the undead, just like human nature. Mr. Maberto, humans will be afraid, but the Tonajal, Viro, and Lantanilan won't be defeated in the face of the undead. Humans will be impulsive and greedy, and human nature is also vain, arrogant, and selfish. But our kingdom, civilization, and order didn't collapse because of this. That's because we still have the second attribute of being social. Madara is the same. They used to be a sheet of loose sand, But the bloodstaff we defeated today is far different from the past. I think you have a deep understanding of this. But Mr. Jacques, you probably didn't think that the Madara we saw today is still an illusion. Without waiting for Count Jacques to nod, Brando continued. The latter opened his mouth and looked very surprised, but Brando didn't give him a chance to speak. The reason why we defeated the bloodstaff today is based on its ignorance of us, and also based on the fact that it still maintains a set of old command system. Count Jacques, you should have heard of the kingdom's military reform, but such a reform began 7 years ago in Madara. Before the War of the Black Rose, they had basically ended this historical mission. Today, Madara has at least 1,000 Emperor's Chosen groups. These Emperor's Chosen groups are different from the army of the Bloodstaff that you and I have seen. The Bloodstaff is arrogant and unruly, and in fact, it is not a direct descendant of the Supreme of Madara. It was defeated by us today probably because the Supreme of Madara needs us to help him eliminate dissidents. He paused. And the real army of Madara has a complete set of mid-level and low-level officers. They will not fall into a state of disunity because of the collapse of the upper command system. Such an undead army can really fight until the last lich falls. Mr. Jacques, you can imagine how Erwin would fight such an enemy and win. Count Jacques stared at the young lord with wide eyes. If Brando had told him all this in the morning, he would have never believed it. It was simply absurd and nonsensical. But at this moment, Brando's strength and knowledge of Madara made him unable to easily doubt it. Especially the 1,000 Emperor's Chosen groups that Brando mentioned. It was like a sudden clap of thunder that made his mouth dry and his mind in a mess for a moment. His sallow complexion and absent-mindedness were within Brando's expectations. Of course, Brando would not tell him that although Madara's expansion direction was towards Erwin, their main enemies were the Wind Elves of Saint Tossel and Fanzin further north. More than half of Madara's 1,000 Emperor's Chosen groups were used to guard against these two huge empires. It was good to scare this guy lest he still had any delusions. In fact, this was not a bad thing. No matter how many troops Madara had at the moment, it did not mean much to a small kingdom like Erwin, because in the future, it might not be able to withstand even one of Sir Black's legions. Now, Erwin only had a glimmer of hope, and that was to make the undead hesitate. There were still a lot of duchies between them and Saint Tossel and Fanzin on the border. Anyway, the Wind Elves would fight with the skeletons of Madara sooner or later. Now, as long as the undead felt that Erwin was more difficult to deal with than those duchies, it would be enough. In history, Erwin awakened too late, and Her Royal Highness was powerless. Cruz's people could not even take care of themselves and connive, which led to the kingdom's final tragedy. This time it might not be the case. But first, the kingdom still needed to have the courage and ability to fight. Brando looked at Count Jacques, whose face had begun to turn pale. He wiped his forehead with his hand, not knowing if he was wiping the rain or wiping the sweat. His mind seemed to be immersed in the fear brought by the 1,000 Emperor's Chosen groups that Brando had described earlier. He asked in a low voice, "Count, is what you said true? Mr. Maberto, even if my information is only 1/3 accurate, what difference does it make to the kingdom if Madara only has 300 regiments?" Brendel looked absent-mindedly at the undead army that was fleeing in the rain. He stroked the horse's mane and asked in a calm manner. He was not in a hurry, but Count Jacques was anxious. He did not know whether Brando was telling the truth or not, but it seemed that there was no need for him to make fun of him. Just like what Brando said, even if his words were only 1/3 accurate, or even a quarter accurate, what difference did it make to the kingdom? There was no difference at all. The nobles knew best what the kingdom was like. Since the Anson era, the struggle between the local and central governments had greatly damaged the strength of the kingdom itself. And after the Battle of Ampere Seal, the confrontation between the North and the South made it even weaker. On the other hand, the Dark Kingdom in the East had always maintained a strong army and tradition of war. It was just that in the past it was scattered, and the lords of the Dark Kingdom did their own thing and fought against each other, so it was not a threat. Today, Madara had been united under the rule of the Supreme, and the nobles of the Dark Kingdom had gathered under the Mercury staff that had reappeared 1,000 years later. Count Jacques suddenly realized that Brando might not be lying, but their traditional thinking had made them ignore this point. Madara already had a huge army, and now that they were united, who would they attack next? Naturally, it could not be the wind elves or Fanzin, so the rest was self-evident. Some things were actually like a layer of window paper. It was hard to think of it before it was broken, but once it was brought up, the rest of the people would suddenly see the light. At this moment, Count Jacques' mood was more or less like this. Although he would rather not be aware of this, at least an idiot could live happily. But now, whenever he thought of Madara, he would be on tenterhooks and think of the undead army waiting to attack. They were the undead, an existence that could not tolerate the living. Apart from death, you could not surrender. Count Jacques' head was full of cold sweat as he thought, but he could not think of a solution. In today's Erewhon, it seemed that other than death, there was only one way to go. The Dark Kingdom was originally a powerful country, and they had the advantage. What was laughable was that the nobles of the kingdom were still in a drunken stupor. Facing such a country, he really did not know how to resolve the crisis in front of him. Perhaps the only way was to exile Cruz? When Count Jacques raised his head to look at Brando again, his eyes were a little unfocused. Brando knew that he was extremely frightened. He sighed. In fact, the reason was very simple. These nobles might have thought about it before, but they always thought that Madara had not reached this step. In history, even on the eve of the Second War of the Black Roses, there were still people who thought that Madara was still in a civil war. But today, he personally told him that the unification of Madara had been brought forward. Sure enough, this count immediately understood what the kingdom was facing. Count Jacques did not speak again, and Brando did not force him. He patted the horse's mane and let it speed up so that he could catch up with the White Lion guards in the valley. He knew that today's words could only give these nobles a hint. Sooner or later, they would understand how Erewhon could survive. And at that time, if there were still stubborn people, then don't blame him for being ruthless. The fate of the kingdom had been given a strong dose of medicine in the Battle of Ampere Seal. Now, it could only be slowly reversed. Brando silently pursed his lips. In his heart, it was not that he did not want to make drastic changes and give the kingdom a new lease of life. But the longer he was in this world, the more he understood the difficulties of this matter. The nobles had ruled the kingdom for too long, and their traditions were already deeply ingrained. Moreover, they were indeed excellent in their own ways. Although Erewhon's class had long been corrupted, they still had power that could not be underestimated. He might be able to eradicate this power, but it would inevitably bring great harm to this ancient kingdom. His subordinates like Carglass, Amandina, Coden, Maria, and even most of the sergeants of the White Lion Knight were inextricably linked to the traditional nobles. Whether they came from the royal faction or the local faction, they were more or less conservative. And to completely eradicate all of this, it would inevitably hurt the people around them. Even Princess Griffine might turn against him because of this. He knew in his heart that the Erewhon that Her Highness wanted was not really a new kingdom built on the ruins. He also did not want, "The opportunity has been handed to you," Brando said to himself. "As for whether you cherish it or not, it's up to you." Soon, the Lantanila Knight rushed from the east bank of the river to join the White Lion Guards. The humans advanced along the river valley, driving the undead army to the south. Before evening, the allied forces of Viro, Lantanilan, and the Tanajil people had in fact completely wiped out most of the mercenaries from the undead lords of the Sea of the Dead Moon. Most of the scattered liches had fled into the nearby forest, and they would become a security problem in this area in the next few months. But at this time, Brando and Cohen could not care so much. These problems would be left to the Vermeer Legion to deal with. The Bloodstaff and his personal guards blended into the remaining half of the skeleton cavalry. At this time, the advantage of the undead began to come into play. The skeleton cavalry that was not affected by physical strength gradually widened the distance between them and the Lantanilan cavalry. Only Brando's Linga Legion, who rode on Pegasi, could catch up with these skeleton cavalry, but of course, he would not do so. Using Grade 4 archers to deal with the skeleton warriors could be said to be crushing, but using them to chase after the real cavalry was simply asking for death. Just like that, the Allied army finally lost track of the remaining undead cavalry before nightfall. Ike was hopping mad, and Jacques' subordinates had a look of pity on their faces. Viro's commander, on the other hand, was distracted for the entire day. Brendel heard from Carglass that he had sent several messengers to the north, and he immediately understood that Duke Viro had indeed gone to seek Duke Viro's opinion. His words during the day were not in vain, and it was up to the nobles to decide on the next course of action. Madara's information was difficult to obtain, but if they really wanted to, it was not difficult to obtain the information that Kargleis had mentioned. Historically, the nobles had never thought of this at all, but this time they had the opportunity to respond. Brando was very calm about the escape of the Bloodstaff, not to mention that there was still a Cruz Knight regiment waiting for it in front of it. Even if it was lucky enough to return to Madara, what good would it do? The Queen of Banshees Yalvit had been waiting for it for a long time. As a symbol of her rebellion against the Emperor of Madara, the Bloodstaff had to die. As for how she would surrender to the Mercury Staff, that was another story. Brando stood in the valley and admired the night view of the Slovenian region. The sky darkened quickly after the beginning of autumn. Before the day had completely disappeared from the mountains, the forest of linden trees was already filled with desolation. It was the last period after the end of summer. The moon in the sky should have been the proud gold sea and the flawless Timmies, but only darkness was left under the rainy weather. On the other side of the valley, he looked at the valley plains of the Silman region. He stared at the gurgling river in that direction and thought that the Bloodstaff should have met its last batch of enemies at this time. However, he was too lazy to care about how the young Cruz people fought. He secretly arranged for Cohen to return to the Silman Hills overnight, and lead his men to replace the Folded Sword Knight Regiment to clean up the battlefield after the battle. He did not want the Cruz people to be exposed to the public for the time being. This time, Tanajo revealed a lot of his strength in order to make Madara quiet down for a while. However, he would try to hide as much as possible. P.S. Today's chapter, from the idea to the writing, took me almost 10 hours to write. After writing it, I really did not have the time and energy to write the next chapter. Today's Sunday second update will be put aside. I'm really sorry, I'll find another time to make it up. I hope everyone will forgive me. Chapter 877. The night belonged to those who never slept, and the remaining undead army advanced under the cover of the night. The undulating ridges of the valley in the darkness were like crouching behemoths, and the silent dark forest, the dim meadows, and the gravel-strewn riverbanks formed a landscape that rapidly receded from both sides of the pale vision of the undead. The Bloodstaff and its high-ranking liches were protected in the very center of these skeleton riders. It raised its bare skull to look at the south of the valley, and the glimmer refracted by the gurgling river outlined the narrow shape of the valley pass in that direction, behind which was the exit to the Silverman Valley. At the mouth of the valley there was a quiet camp, similar to all the camps of the undead. This camp was composed of a large number of bony thorns and a few large black tents sparsely scattered, but this camp was empty at the moment, and there were no signs of activity inside. The army of the undead stopped at the command of the Bloodstaff. There was originally a team of liches stationed here, and they had hundreds of skeleton warriors under them, but these undead seemed to have turned into air at the moment and disappeared without a trace. The Bloodstaff sent out several scouts, who quickly ran back and brought back the same news as what it saw. The camp was empty, and there were no signs of battle. The Bloodstaff was not a fool, and immediately understood that enemies had appeared on its way back. It found us. Brund exhaled a white breath in the cold night, and there was only sparse light in the rainy night. The blade in his hand was dark and did not reflect any light. It's awareness, not discovery. Aaliyah corrected. It's all about the same. No, there's a big difference. In terms of tactics, sensing our existence means that our position has been determined, but the realization is just a guess. There's a big difference in this. Brund, it's not your style to be vague. Shut up. Aaliyah wanted to say more, but little Pero also turned his head and glared at him, saying, "Shut up." He opened his mouth and finally shut it obediently. There was a low laugh in the dark night, and the young Cruz people were obviously used to Aaliyah's deflated look. "Are those the undead?" a female knight asked curiously. Little Pero looked at the skeletons from afar and nodded. The Empire fought against them in Crete, so this is what they look like. Those necromancers have been desecrating corpses at the borders of the Empire. The Holy Cathedral should have punished them long ago. "Aren't you afraid?" Aaliyah asked curiously. "I heard that you women are afraid of these skeletons." "Aaliyah, shut up," the female knight replied angrily. "Nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth. They're alerted. What should we do?" asked Brund, sitting as straight as a javelin in the saddle, as if he had not seen his bad friend make a fool of himself. Under the night sky it was drizzling. His military uniform and wet hair stuck to his body. The gaps in his armor seemed to be full of water, which made people feel very uncomfortable. However, it did not affect him at all. He was like a model knight of the Empire. It doesn't matter. This is their only way. The Count fought a good battle. There aren't many of them left. We can just wait here. There's no need to play any tricks with them. Little Pero replied. The more complicated the tactic, the easier it is to fail. Brund recited as if reciting scriptures. Dogmatist. Aaliyah muttered under his breath. The Folded Sword Knight Regiment was in formation on the riverbank 100 meters away from the other end of the undead camp. Hundreds of cavalry were silent on the gravel, leaving only rows of cavalry swords and pairs of bright light blue eyes full of fighting spirit. The Bloodstaff quickly discovered this unusual cavalry. It was a little surprised because it thought that it would be ambushed, but it did not expect these bold humans to set up a formation in front of it and fight it head-on. It suddenly felt ashamed and annoyed. If it was a day ago, how could such a small group of human cavalry dare to be so arrogant? But even now, it still had more than 1,000 skeleton cavalry in its hands. These human cavalry simply did not take it seriously. The Bloodstaff clenched the skeletal staff in his hand. It was as if he could feel the anger in his burning soul fire. A few necromancer apprentices who followed him quickly whispered to him that this might be a trap set by the humans. But the Bloodstaff shook its head. Before it could speak, the dark mercenaries around it let out empty and meaningless laughter. The Bloodstaff looked at these guys with some annoyance. There's no need. This is our only way. They can just attack directly. There's no need to be so mysterious. No more than 300. The dark mercenaries who began to sneer quickly estimated the number of Crew's Knight. Darkness was an ally of the eternal dead. These humans really don't know what's good for them. Send a scout cavalry to test their strength. The Bloodstaff suddenly sensed some danger. The young people of Cruz looked at the small group of skeleton cavalry that separated from the undead army, and immediately understood the other party's intention. Little Pero did not say a word, made a gesture, and also ordered Brund to lead a small group of knight to meet them. These folded sword knights were by no means new recruits on the battlefield for the first time. Before the life and death encounter in the deadly tundra forest, they had already fought with many enemies. These skeletons were just an interlude in their military career. Brund quickly intercepted the small group of skeleton cavalry, and then the two sides began to fight. It only took a few minutes to wipe out the opposite side, but none of the undead turned around and fled, which surprised him slightly and made him cautious. The army of the undead was indeed very different from the opponents he had encountered before. The strength of the silver rank is about between the middle and lower levels. The dark mercenaries from the Sea of the Dead Moon quickly came to a conclusion. The soul fire in their eyes flashed as they spoke to the Bloodstaff in a hoarse voice. I'm afraid there's still some hidden strength. In other words, Erwin has another 4th-grade cavalry team. The Bloodstaff replied in a deep voice. No wonder they're so arrogant. Its tone was full of unwillingness, feeling that it should not have come to Erwin at all. Its past understanding of the kingdom was completely subverted in just one day, and it still could not figure out how the elite human army that was beyond its imagination came about. There should not be such an army in the southern border of the kingdom, and no one told it about it. The news it got from all channels pointed out that this was the most empty moment in the southern part of the kingdom. But now, the Bloodstaff faintly sensed that it seemed to have been betrayed. It was very smart, and it already knew that the road back to Madara would not be easy, but it still had a chance. It took away all the high-grade liches from the battlefield, and they were its most important force. As long as this foundation was still there, it would be a day when it could rise again. It came back to its senses and coldly looked at the army in front of it that it thought was Erwin's cavalry. Its strength was almost 6 times the opponent's, and even if this cavalry was a 4th-grade army, it still had a certain advantage. I have to let these humans understand that the night belongs to the immortals. The Bloodstaff gently waved his skeletal staff and pointed it forward. The skeletal cavalry began to disperse. These skeletal riders with flames dancing in their eye sockets rode side by side in the valley. They trotted forward and soon formed a wedge attack formation. During the entire process, the entire army did not make much noise. Only the crisp sound of skeletal horses' hooves hitting the gravel could be heard. It was so quiet that it made one's hair stand on end. This silent momentum was enough to suppress any human army, but the young people of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment were an exception. They had seen the scene of wolves galloping on the tundra, and the scene in front of them was nothing compared to the scene in the deadly frost forest. They really came. Aaliyah even growled with some excitement. They had to come. Brend replied. You're really boring. Little Pero turned his head at this time, and his gaze swept across everyone's faces. Count Tonagel told us not to expose our strength above gold rank. This is related to our main mission here, so do you understand how this battle should be fought? Sigh. Sigh. Hearing Little Pero's words, the crowd suddenly sighed. What's the fun in that, Little Pero? Aaliyah could not help but shout. Let's do a good job. Our bones are going to rust from boredom. You can tell that to His Royal Highness. Little Pero glanced at him and replied. This time these young people from Cruz were speechless. They might as well be killed if they were asked to bargain with His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. Everyone knew that the Crown Prince was serious and usually very serious. He was obviously about the same age as them, but he seemed to be 10 years older than them. The key was that the Crown Prince had the commander behind him. These young people dared to ignore the majesty of the royal family, but in front of Veronica, they were like mice that saw a cat. The square formation of the knight was suddenly silent, and Little Pero nodded with satisfaction. Get ready, the first wave of attack. He raised his hand. The knight raised their hands in unison, as if a black forest had suddenly risen. At this distance, it was difficult for the bloodstaff to see the movements of the Cruz people, but it still sensed the abnormality. The skeleton knight had entered the best distance to sprint, but the other party still did not move. What was the reason for this? Did the other party's commander not understand that when two cavalry met, whoever ran into the best position to attack first would have the upper hand? Besides, the number of these Arrowan cavalry was far less than it. In theory, they should take advantage of their flexibility to make the first move to make up for the disadvantage in strength, but the other party seemed to be scared and stood there stupidly. Of course, the bloodstaff did not think that the other party was scared silly. How could a commander who could command a tier 4 army be a fool? It instinctively felt that there was a conspiracy, but it was too late at this time. The army had already started, and it was impossible to stop or turn around. What the hell is going on? For the first time, the bloodstaff could not help but ask the unruly dark mercenaries. But these experienced tacticians were also dumbfounded at this moment. They did not understand what this strange cavalry wanted to do. In the end, an old necromancer from the barren territory in the easternmost part of the Sea of the Dying Moon saw some clues. They seemed to be preparing some kind of spell. When the necromancer saw this, his voice changed a little, because it was not because he saw it, but because he felt the majestic aura of magic coming head-on. Preparing a spell? The bloodstaff was also dumbfounded. Today, he saw archers on horseback, cavalry without horses, and wizards used as archers. He did not expect to see armored cavalry wizards in the end. They're wearing armor, full cavalry armor, and you tell me they're preparing a spell? The bloodstaff could not help but roar a little angrily. But as soon as his voice fell, a dazzling light flashed in the square formation of the Folded Sword Knight Regiment. The young knights of Cruz raised their right hands. Unlike most knight regiments, most of them were not wearing thick iron handguards, but beautiful platinum handguards. The biggest difference between this kind of handguard and ordinary handguards was that the 10 fingers were not connected together. It had an elegant and delicate beauty, but in addition to its artistic beauty, the biggest advantage of this kind of handguard was that it could leave space for the wearer to wear a ring. Of course, it was not an ordinary ring, but the so-called little secrets of the witches located on both sides of the magic triangle magic rings. On the fingers of these young Cruz people was a piece of sparkling beautiful rings inlaid with rubies, fire agates, emeralds and blue crystals. Each ring was engraved with mysterious runes with countless magic circles. If Brando's army was already extremely luxurious in the eyes of Count Jacques, but compared with these young knights from Cruz, it was really the difference between a beggar and a rich man. 80% of the young knights of Folded Sword came from the descendants of various noble families in the empire. The cost of equipment for each of them was almost enough to equip an entire knight domain. This amount of money was just a drop in the bucket for the empire's aristocracy. It seemed to be a matter of course, but in a remote place like Erewhon it was unprecedented. The Bloodstaff had the honor to witness how the elite knight of Cruz flaunted their strength and wealth. In some ways it was the first person in Madara. Yalvit was standing next to her warhorse. The thick white armor on her body seemed to emit endless flames. This lady, who was called the Queen of Banshees by all the Dark Lords in the Sea of the Dead Moon, rarely showed her face, but today she was not wearing a helmet. Below the helmet was a pale face. For a lady, this face could be considered beautiful, but it was full of a gloomy aura. Her hair was like a burning phosphorescence. From time to time, there were silver flames flying around, reflecting the flat forehead without the slightest trace of blood. Under the sword-like slender eyebrows, a pair of silver eyes were hidden in the deep eye sockets. At this moment she was pursing her thin lips, her cheeks were a little sunken, and she looked very silent. She did not speak, but her eyes reflected the distant flames shining brightly. Several banshees were guarding the Queen of Banshees. "Let's go." After looking for a moment, she suddenly turned around, grabbed the saddle and got on the horse's back. The Queen of Banshees' voice was very ethereal, like a faint singing voice. "There's nothing to see. The Bloodstaff is finished." "Your Majesty, you mean the Erewhon people defeated the Bloodstaff?" a banshee asked in a sharp voice. "Don't call me Your Majesty, Vigny. There is only one Majesty in Madara," Yalvit replied. "It's not strange that the Erewhon people defeated the Bloodstaff. Just an idiot. It was played around by the Insursta dragon from the beginning to the end. The poor thing thought that His Majesty would secretly acquiesce to its actions. I really admire Tarkus for daring to deal with that guy. Even if you were sold by the Insursta dragon, sometimes you still have to help him count the money." Yalvit brazenly ridiculed the confidence of the few supreme beings in the Empire. The banshees hissed and did not dare to continue speaking. She finally looked at the flash on the other side of the mountain and said to herself, "But the Erewhon people did give me a little surprise. Do you see? This is the heritage of this ancient land. Don't underestimate any enemy. After thousands of years of accumulation, they have some ingenious knowledge and secrets. They can always bring you surprises." However, accidents in war were fatal. The Bloodstaff had always looked at its opponents with the same foolish eyes in the past. Today was a battle of life and death. It would not hold back, but how could its enemies be merciful? The new dark nobles in the Empire can't wait to make a name for themselves in this land. But this time, I'm afraid His Majesty will have a reason to persuade them. Why should His Majesty care about this little Erewhon? Yalvit shook her head and did not refute her personal maid. She knew that the Supreme Being did not care about Erewhon, but the attitude of the four holy cathedrals. Erewhon suddenly showed his strong side today, but it was hard to say what it meant. The Count of Tonagel seemed to be related to the Wind Elves, but the power he held had traces of the Templar. He seemed to have appeared out of thin air overnight and had a strong force. "Interesting," she said softly, "interesting." But there was one more thing she did not say. She even had a faint feeling that the army of Erewhon people had a very familiar aura. The Queen of Banshees shook her head and muttered in her heart, "No, this should not be possible. P.S. A new week has arrived. Please get some votes, comrades."